by color, but I can look on here. Oh, there you go. Great, thank you.
Great.
Morning. Hi, do you remember which session you chose? All right, well,
help me.
2 specks of data. There we go. There you go. Not bad for early in the morning.
Oh, good.
That worked.
Okay, we're about to start. You can take a seat. I want to know whether the back, Paul, can you hear me back there?
No.
Okay. Who can't? Emily? Not so good? Okay, there is a way to turn this up, and Isaac, our communications guy, will find out how it is. Isaac, are you in the room? Okay. So we'll especially turn it up when Francine comes up here, so voice is a little louder. Well, welcome. We're really pleased you could join us here. My name is Peter Clutterbuck. I'm with the Marvyn Novick Legacy Planning Group, and I know many of you in the room knew Marvyn. Passed away in 2016, and our work with him, and we try to especially also invite some people who maybe didn't know Marvyn, but who are in your networks as younger leaders in the community, so that we have a good mix of people in the room. People are out there and established, and people now coming up and kind of leading the social justice charge. We had a good public lecture last night with Francine Mestrum and a panel, Joe Mihevik, Alejandro Bravo, and Opie Hope. Very good discussion at the YWCA. We're going to do a bit of a deeper dive into this subject of the social commons framework and what its relevance might be, and how it might be guiding in terms of our own work in social justice, coming together and collaborating more effectively for our causes, or what are its weaknesses and deficiencies in terms of helping us out in that way. So this is not kind of a declarative thing about we got to do this. This is an exploratory exercise around the usefulness of the social commons framework, and we actually chose it because we did want to honor Marvyn, as we have several events over the last couple of years, and a publication that we're actually producing of his writings with commentaries from his associates and colleagues, many of whom are in this room, about how relevant his writings, say, in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s are to our times, and looking forward on a variety of issues. As you know, he worked in social development here in Metro Toronto. He worked in child poverty. He worked on poverty reduction campaigns with us, a leader for us in many ways, especially with the Social Planning Network in Ontario over the last decade of his life. So we thought, since he was kind of looking at and considering with his colleague Brigitte what the usefulness of the social commons framework was about before he passed, I think he would appreciate that we should be looking forward rather than just back on his work and its influence. And he would really want to be part of this day, for sure, and have the final word at the end of it as well, as you probably can imagine. So we thought it'd be appropriate to honor him by exploring this concept. And I'm going to go through what our day will involve in just a second, and some of the technicalities around how to get on the Wi-Fi, for example. But it's important to acknowledge at the outset the land that we're on, and what we're doing here today. And as I actually, often these land acknowledgements seem obligatory, seem just like words on a page. When I started to think and studied about this particular land acknowledgement, I realized in lots of ways it represents a really early good example of what commenting is about. How people share, how they assume responsibility, how they deal with kind of getting out of warring relationships into collaborative, mutually caring relationships. And that's when I read this land acknowledgement that I used before in a different way after having studied a bit about the social commons. So we are on the territory of the dish with one spoon territory. And the dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississauga, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. This was shortly after the French and Indian War in the late 18th century. The dish, or sometimes called the bowl, represents what is now southern Ontario. And all who share this territory eat out of one dish, one bowl, with only one spoon. And as it turned out, if you investigate what the wampum belt that was created for that treaty was, they intentionally did not represent any knives on it. You know, share one spoon, one bowl. And that means we have to share responsibility. It's not just a matter of sharing what's there, but have some responsibility. Share the responsibility of ensuring the dish is never empty, which includes taking care of the land and the creatures we share it with, and each other. And that essentially is the spirit of this land acknowledgement, which I think is quite consistent with and gives us guidance in terms of what we're tending to today. So with that, let me give you an idea how we're going to begin the day. We're going to Brigitte Kitchen, who is one of our planning group members that I'll be identifying by name for a certain purpose in just a minute. Dr. Brigitte Kitchen, retired from York University social work. Marvyn and she used to meet fairly regularly, at least once a month, sometimes twice a month, to talk about writing together and exploring frameworks like the social commons. And she hoped to be here today, and as it turned out, a flight that was supposed to leave on Sunday had to leave today, and she had to be on it. So she was going to open with a statement that kind of linked what this topic is about to Marvyn's thinking before he passed, and their discussions. And we did get her to do it on videotape, though. We have it also in a written statement that you pick up at the table over there if you wish. And so we're going to have that to lead off, followed by Dr. Francine Mestrum, who I'll introduce after we see the video from Brigitte. And then we are going to have a chance, which we didn't last night because of the timing, but after Dr. Mestrum talks, we'll have a chance for you to ask questions or make comments about what you think about it from the floor, about the notion and its implications, you know. And frankly, as I see it, Dr. Mestrum and the social commons advocates, they really challenge not only neoliberal society and what it's about, but those of us on the left trying to struggle to gain equity and social justice, challenge us in many ways in terms of how we do things and how we have to think about working together. So we're going to break down into 4 topics, as you know from the program you have, on decent work and employment, the civic commons, integrating social and environmental justice, and kind of protecting the social services, which has to do with tax and the role of government. There's 4 sessions there with the people identified as panelists, you'll see. They're excellent panels, and actually we were fortunate, we polled you about what were your first choice. Since we can only do one, you can only be at one, it's only run once for an hour and a half, and everybody gets their first choice, so that's a happy consequence. So you spread fairly evenly, although the 2 largest groups are in this room, the decent work group and the integrating social and environmental justice. So I think and because of the space we have available at Open House, we'll do the integrating social and environmental justice down there and the decent work up here we'll set up. You won't need microphones for groups of about 20 or 25 people. And we'll conduct that for an hour and a half. Now you'll notice by the dot on your name tag identifies which group you selected, so you're getting exactly what you selected. We aim to please here. There were no conflicts or problems. The one problem might be, you know, if you have a red-green color blindness like I do, you might have a problem that way. But we put the red and green both in this room, so we get you in the room and you got a 50% chance of getting in the right place. That's the way we figure. And also, if you have any questions in the small groups where we've assigned some of our planning group members or through the conference, these little hand-joined badges are being worn by planning group members. So if you have any questions, find one of us with these little badges on and ask the question there. And we're going to, at the break, have to get those people who are in other rooms. One room is on the 3rd floor, the real room. The other room is the shadow room at the other end of this building. We'll have one of our planning group members with a sign guide you to those rooms, especially the 3rd floor one, which is a bit complicated in terms of the elevators and the stairs and finding the room. And so if we find you wandering around, we'll direct you to the right place. We're going to break after the groups. We'll have lunch about 12:15, and then Leila Sarangi from Campaign 2000 will be giving us a mini report on the National Report Card, Campaign 2000, of course, which many of us in the room were involved in the early years in forming, and which Marvyn was a major leader in. Issues an annual report card, and so we thought it appropriate for Leila, this was released just a few weeks ago, to give us an overview here on a writing by writing breakdown, a kind of summary of child poverty situation. Then we have our Future Forward panel, which in each of the 4 topic areas, there's a younger person, new leader emerging, or really entering the field, and they're going to be both reporting back briefly on the discussion there, but also offering their own reflections on what social commons, as they can see it, how useful it might be moving forward as they continue their work in the field. So there were 4 people planned for that. Tiffany Balducci, unfortunately, with the Civic Commons, a young labor leader from Durham region, sent me a note that she's got strep throat. And I've had that, I don't know if you have. She's not obviously going to make it here. But I think we got Anita Khanna, a former coordinator of Campaign 2000, going to take her place, so that's good. And Joey Edward will moderate that session, and also will announce the Marvyn Nova Scholarship that is going to be launched. And then we'll have concluding comments from Francine. And just to be able to identify the people who are planning group members, if you have any questions, and Julia Novick, Marvyn's daughter, I think she's still out at the table, you probably met her there. Krista Fryder, put your hand up. Joey Edward, Susan McGrath, Shelley Cleverly, Laura Rothman, and Isaac Thornley. And Isaac is our key guy. We wouldn't be here with any kind of technology or communications or programs or a website without Isaac's help, and I neglected to thank him last night, so I made sure that I got his name in early today. He's a great help to us. And we have supported by York University an internship to be able to pay Isaac a little money. He's going to environmental studies at York as well. Later in the day, Joey will kind of tell you all of the people who helped sponsor and make this day possible. So, with that, I think we're ready, Isaac. Oh, one last thing. People were, you got the chance, if you're part of the Twitterverse, wandering around there, on your table is how to get into the system, right? It's not as easy, I guess, as just using the Wi-Fi number. That's how you get into the system. And I was going to read it out so you got copies. So Brigitte Kitchen, colleague of Marvyn Novick.
It is my pleasure to share with you this morning what the idea of the social commons meant to Marvyn and I, and why we thought it important to pursue. In our weekly conversations over many years until his death, Marvyn and I struggled to find ways to confront the world of neoliberalism as it was unfolding before us. Our conversations gave us the welcome opportunity to what we jokingly refer to as rubbing and polishing each other's brains. This is a quote from Michel Montaigne, the French philosopher, so not our own. 4 points informed our weekly discussions. Firstly, neoliberal reality and its dominant discourse. Secondly, the dignity and inherent worth of all human persons. Thirdly, the real tragedy of the commons. Fourthly, the challenge to create the commons. We started from the uncomfortable reality of seeing millions of people around the world deprived and dispossessed of the wealth created by their joint work. In Canada, the political imperatives of market interest were sweeping away many of the crucial social programs of the post-war welfare state. Neoliberal economic progress moved forward at the cost of increasing inequalities between individuals, families, communities, and nations, undermining human well-being and generating social divisions. Marvyn had become alarmed that the language of market forces had been allowed to dominate public discourse. Words, he strongly believed, shape the way we see and understand the world we live in. The commons was an idea that immediately caught our attention. We were familiar with Garrett Harding's warning that the tragedy of the commons was that the possession of commonly owned resources would inevitably lead to their overuse and exhaustion. unfortunately never gained much attention. It was our belief that in the context of the commons, there had to be a reciprocal relationship of rights and responsibilities. For Marvyn and me, the real tragedy of the commons was the failure of the signatories of the Declaration to live up to their commitments. As the foremost hurdle for this failure, we identified the unfortunate interdependence of capitalism and racism. Capitalism, for its operative mechanism to throw out winners and losers. We ask ourselves whether the system could possibly be transformed or only ameliorated. Racism for the presumption that some people are more equal than others. We considered it a gross violation of the commons and its tenets that dignity without equality and equity were possible. The free market profit motive is constantly reframing the rights of millionaires and billionaires in the form of demands for a more pliable, precarious workforce, whilst falsely claiming that rising inequality would enhance the wealth of nations. Sadly, my conversations with Marvyn have come to an end. But today's symposium is your invitation to rub and polish your brains, to advance the debate about the commons and the building of a world where we humans can live together in dignity and harmony. I wish you good luck for today.
Brigitte is sorry that she could not be here today. One thing about Brigitte, which I would never say if she were in the room because she'd be too embarrassed, but she was concerned that we have some younger people, new leaders coming into this discussion with us, and she provided the registrations for actually about 18. We managed to get about 10 or 12 here, and I would never be able to say that this year because she wanted to remain, she would be too embarrassed, but that's an indication of her commitment to this, and we do have about 10 or 12 younger people here we wouldn't otherwise have met. This is also a real point for David Lewis Stein, who was also on our planning group, and as you know, passed away in September, just about a week before he was hosting one of our last planning group meetings. He was really looking forward to this. He's a longtime colleague and friend of Marvyn Novick, and was really committed to, as well to new leadership coming into the field. So, let's begin then. I think we're right on schedule in terms of what's in your programs and the time limit. I'll try to time keep during the day and manage it that way. I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Francine Mestrum to join us. When we started, we don't have a lot of resources. This is happening because some generous organizations contributed to it. We're all volunteers. The SPNO is kind of a host for this event, but we don't have the resources to run it. It's really dependent on volunteer energy to produce, and so when we were thinking, how can we get a real speaker about this, who really has been grounded in it, even in Europe and in Latin America, we were reading Francine Mestrum, of course, whose book we found, as Brigitte said, and her writings on social Europe, which are fairly regular on a range of topics in the social policy area that are quite illuminating. So we took a chance and we contacted her by email and she kindly agreed to join us. Look forward to coming to North America, to Canada, to talk about this concept that she's done a lot of discussing with people in other parts of the world about. Francine's a researcher and activist in social development and coordinates the network of the Global Social Justice Network. She has worked at different European institutions and at the universities of Brussels, Antwerp, and Ghent. She's now chairman, actually, of the Global Social Justice, an association working on the promotion of transformative, universal, and social protection and the common good of humanity. We've had a chance, some of us, over the last day and a half or so, to be with Francine. She did an excellent lecture for us last night that really set up a good panel discussion with the people I mentioned earlier. We asked her to help us get a little bit deeper into it, refer to some of the issues we're talking about this morning later on. And so she's kindly agreed to do not just one, but 2 talks with us, and I asked Francine to come forward.
Very good morning. Let me just repeat in one sentence how very happy I am to be here. It's a real honor to speak here, have the opportunity. Closer? Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you. Just to say it's a real honor to be here, to be able to talk to you and remembering Marvyn Novick, who unfortunately I have not known. Now, yesterday I had the opportunity to talk to you about different meanings we can give to words like poverty, like social protection, social justice even. And of course, if we talk to each other and we're all using the same concepts, but we give them different meanings, this can lead to a lot of confusion, and it can lead to a lot of disappointment. So it is very important, before we start a discussion, to know exactly what we are talking about. And certainly when we talk about social commons, which is a new concept, and the whole thinking of commons is still very fluid, let me say. We really have to know what we are talking about. And most of all, what we want it to mean. Because we give words their meaning. They're not falling out of the sky. They are always the result of a social relationship. Now, I would like to explain very briefly why we do need these social commons, instead of a couple of initiatives that you probably know and that have been offered by international organizations. I think of the ILO and the social protection clause, and I think of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. Now, oh, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. It's because of the coffee. Now, there are 2 reasons why I think we have to go beyond these initiatives. They are good, let me say that, to avoid all misunderstandings. We have to support these initiatives. If they were achieved, this would be a real progress for the whole of humanity. But we have to go beyond, let me give you 2 reasons. One reason concerns the content, the other reason concerns the strategy. The social protection flows are very interesting, and we certainly, again, we have to support them. And the ILO itself refers to this going beyond and the possibility to refer to the International Convention of 1952, which gives a full program for social security, social protection. At the same time, this recommendation of the ILO is not very clear on universalism. And it might end up as the World Bank wants it to end up. That is, a social protection for the needy and not for all. And that would mean a poor social protection. And most of all, if you only work for the needy, for the poor, you cannot stop poverty. You cannot eradicate poverty. You cannot prevent poverty. And that is why we need this universalism very badly. Also, the ILO does not offer any guarantees against privatizations. While in some cases, a cooperation with the private sector might be welcome, we should not be, by definition, against this. The privatization and deregulation efforts of neoliberal forces in the past decades certainly have to be resisted. The second international initiative that all countries are committed to are the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. Again, these are very positive in the very first instance because they are for the North as well as for the South. But here we can say outright that these will not be met. And in fact, we will even not know. Because for 16 or 17 Sustainable Development Goals, there are in total 233 indicators. For half of these indicators, we have no data, as we have no data for the Millennium Development Goals. So we will not even know. But as far as data show up to today, they will certainly not be met. As for inequality, you may know that the World Bank statistics are very, very problematic, as are the poverty statistics. Now there is another reason, a strategic reason, why it is better to develop our own programs and our own objectives. Our national governments are committed to these international goals, all of them. The goals are the results of a global discourse that has been developed over the past decades. It means that it says what the powerful people of this planet are ready to give. They fully agree to fight poverty. It's not that expensive. And they fully agree to fight inequality because they define it very, very narrowly. So, national governments should be fully committed in implementing this agenda. And then you can ask, why should social movements spend their time and energy in fighting something that has already been given to them? Surely we can remember our governments of these promises. But we should spend our time and energy on something better, on something that we want, on something that we think is badly needed. And that is why I think this program of social commons can be very useful. So let us work on our own agenda, on what we think is necessary to eradicate poverty, to preserve the environment, to reduce inequality, and to really help and protect people to make the world a better place. So that is what we can do, I think, and should do with social commons. And that is why we should focus on the central elements: human rights, participation, emancipation, universalism, public services, legal instruments, social, economic, and political transformation. We have to define our priorities. We have to look at non-discrimination, solidarity, and reciprocity. How exactly we have to do this, and how you have to do this in this city and in this country, I cannot tell you. This is for you to find out with the groups you're working with. All I can do is give a couple of guidelines. First of all, I would like to refer to a global charter that we have made, a global charter on social protection rights. That is not a binding text, obviously. It is an aspirational text. It is something that you can refer to know the principles that you can use in your daily work with our target groups. And secondly, I would like very briefly to look at the four topics that you will discuss today. The first topic is decent work and income inequality. This is, of course, a very delicate and difficult point of labor rights. I guess that in Canada, as elsewhere, you are faced with precariousness of work, with so-called atypical forms of work, like the Uberization, which means you will have to look for the priorities that people want to define. Is it wages? Is it labor costs? decent labor contracts? Is it working there? Or do you just want to do away with this atypical forms of work? These are different possibilities that you will have to find out with the people you work with. Also, talking of social commons, you might give priority to the development of alternative forms of enterprises. The sector of social and solidarity economy, which could be a way to introduce other values away from profit making and away from economic growth. Cooperatives are just one example. The second topic concerns social and environmental justice. This is easier said than done, though there are many possibilities. And as I said yesterday, social justice can be an important contribution to environmental justice. In the housing sector, it is obvious, but also in the health sector, through the elimination of toxic residues, in order to achieve better health, to have cleaner water, to have clean air to breathe. Just think of what social justice can do for the environment, and what you can offer to people in terms of material well-being. The third topic is the civic commons and the framework of cities. Here, everything will depend on the competences, obviously, the competences of local governments. I guess it will not be in this country social protection, which most of the time is federal competence. But you might think of a local charter for local people in terms of social rights. You might think of public transport, housing, obviously utilities such as water, gas, electricity, the legal framework for evictions, for cutting power or water, etc. All this will have to be discussed with your target groups. And you will have to discuss with these groups and with local governments. You will have to look for solutions that can contribute to change, such as, for instance, I don't know if it exists in this country, automatic attribution of allowances, single social security numbers, etc. And then the fourth topic of access, services, the role of government. Now, in the commons discussion, we very often say that commons go beyond states and markets, which is right. But that does not mean that the commons go without states and markets. We need public authorities, and we need markets, even if these markets will have to respond to a different logic, and not a profit and capitalistic logic. If we talk about taxes, we know we have to tax the international transactions, we have to tax the wealthy, and we also know that poor people often do not benefit from tax cuts simply because they are too poor to pay taxes. So there should be compensatory measures for poor people. And in this respect, I think we also have to think of environmental justice, because many so-called environmental taxes are particularly damaging for poor people and for lower classes. Think of a CO2 tax that has provoked in France a huge revolt of the so-called yellow jackets. You have to examine how tax measures can contribute to help the poor, while at the same time help preserve the environment. The old rule that the strongest shoulders should carry the heaviest burden is very correct indeed. Now, all these points will have to be discussed with your target groups. And you will see that very probably most topics, well, I guess you know, most topics look very different when you look at them from the perspective of the poor. The people you work with will give you the answers. There are many answers will not be the right answers, and they certainly will not all be convergent. So the final solutions will be the result of a long reflection, a long-term thinking, adapted to the circumstances your people live in, adapted to the needs and possibilities of this city and this country. A long-term process probably never finalized, but in my eyes, it is a wonderful way to start. It is a way to start with dialogue, with discussions, with negotiations, with participation of all, with the involvement of all, which means it is a collective work in constant dialogue and consultation, in constant reflection on how to free people from the cruel system we are living in today. And if you look around the world today, especially today, from Santiago de Chile to Quito to La Paz today, to Hong Kong, to Indonesia, to Iraq, to Lebanon, we see that social justice is what people are fighting for. And we should hear these voices, and I think that if we can do something with this concept of social justice, to try to realize a bit more of social justice in this world, we will have done a very great job. Thank you very much, and I wish you very, very good luck.
So, we wanted to give you a chance to maybe think about any questions you may have, just what the concept is about, or challenges you see in actually implementing it, or how it resonates or doesn't with you in terms of being a framework that's useful for accomplishing your own work, your colleagues and other organizations in the community. So we have some, we can take some mics to the floor, and let me get some help from one of my group members to be prepared. Why don't we begin? Does anybody have an immediate question or comment? So why don't you just, for a few minutes, have a little buzz group at your table, talk about what you heard, what sense it makes or not, what don't you understand, or what do you really want to challenge? Just to take a few minutes, I'll call us back to order, and we'll see what questions emerge from the table. Okay, let's see what we got coming out. First of all, it's Francine here. There was a question for clarification that came out from our volunteer. Maybe I shouldn't stop this. Francine, there was a question around, you used some quotes and reference to research in some organizations like the ILO, and not everyone necessarily knows that group, or how, maybe where the Sustainable Development Goals came from as well.
Two clarifications. I mentioned the ILO. The ILO is the International Labour Organization in Geneva, which is the only international organization that survived the Second World War. It is celebrating this year its centenary. It is 100 years old. And a very important message of the ILO in the preamble of its constitution of 1919 is, after the First World War, peace is not possible without social justice. And this is something very important that we should never forget. The second thing I would like to say about these Sustainable Development Goals, there's something very bizarre. The World Bank started in 1990 with a program for poverty reduction. A bank, never forget it, a bank started with poverty reduction. Now this became a global program. I'm not going to dwell on it, but let us say that this poverty reduction was nothing more than a label put onto the structural adjustment programs of the World Bank and of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Now, this was such a success that many countries and the United Nations themselves made a program. Do I have 2 minutes? because there's something very interesting that happened. After the fall of the Wall of Berlin in 1989, the UN organized a whole series of global conferences on climate in 1992 in Rio, on human rights in Vienna in 1993, 1994 on social development, 1995 on women, on gender in region, 1996 on habitat, right to housing and right to the city. Now all these conferences produced consensual action programs. Now of course these programs have limits, and of course we were at that time at the peak of neoliberalism. But at the same time, in all those programs, you had the basic principles and values of the United Nations, which is cooperation, which is solidarity. Now, I mentioned 1995, Social Development Conference in Copenhagen, with 3 important chapters equivalent: poverty, employment, and social integration. Again, with limits, but good programs. This was difficult for rich countries. 1996, 1 year later, the OECD, the Organization for Economic Development and Cooperation, produced a new program with just 8 points. And the whole program of the Social Development Conference and of the other conferences was wiped away. And in 2000, these 8 points became the Millennium Development Goals. A program that was really watered down from the different conferences. And to just one more detail, one of the 8 points was reproductive health and reproductive rights for women. This also was wiped away by the UN, by conservative countries and others. So we ended up in 2000 with the Millennium Development Goals. Okay, we're going to fight poverty. Millennium Development Goal number 1 was half extreme poverty between 1990 and 2015. Now, just think of it. A half extreme poverty, which means that the other half can die. Because extreme poverty, as the UN Secretary General said, extreme poverty kills. Because of hunger, because of diseases, of children below 5 years old. Okay, we're going to fight extreme poverty. And these objectives were met in 2015. Why? Because of China. China had met all these objectives even before they were started. But okay, at the global level, these objectives were met. And extreme poverty was halved in 2015. And then the world community said, now we're going further. We have to take care of the environment. And they made a program which the intentions are always very good. To combine the social development with environmental preservation. And so they made 16 sustainable development goals, which are valid for the North as well as for the South, which is, I think, very, very important. Now, all our countries are committed to these. And they are very interesting. Goal number 1 implies social protection, implies the social protection flaws of the International Labour Organization. And there is a objective number 10 on fighting inequality. So you can do a lot with these sustainable development goals. guess there are too many. And it's too difficult to really meet them all, and with 233 indicators, I think it will be very difficult, especially if you have no data. But okay, we have these development goals, you can work with them, and it is a very good guideline and a very good orientation. But if you read them, and you see what is mentioned for social protection, you will see it is very, 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 very limited, very, very modest. So if we really want to work for social justice, we have to go beyond.
Okay, very good. I want to just point out, I keep neglecting, Corey Orchak here is videotaping our sessions. We hope to put this stuff on our website after, maybe continue the website, depending on how this discussion continues. Just wanted to know that. And Isaac is taking pictures. If you don't want your picture to appear on the website or at this event, we'll put a bar over your eyes. We won't put it in. Okay? And Corey, during the day, I might ask some of you to step aside and maybe have a little answer to a question that Corey might capture on tape. Give us a little summary highlight of 10 or 12 minutes of this event as well. But you talked at your tables. Maybe there's some observation came up, there's some question that you'd like to advance. John, there's a mic over there somewhere. John Cartwright, Behaviour Council.
At our table, most of us are social justice activists, and when we look at the framework, we kind of say that's what guides us. This is like a reflection of the documents of the Canadian movement in all of the elements. So policy-wise, many folks, I'm sure, in this room already are working from a similar. So I think the question at our table is, how does this translate into strategies, tactics, organizations? Is this my own question? You know, the World Social Forum was trying to raise many of these, and it's now not as a viable organization. How does this get translated into actual power? Is that part of a conversation, or is it just sharing a philosophical framework and then inviting others who aren't yet social justice warriors to look at it and consider it in their own work?
Yeah, I think this is local work to do. This is work that you will have to. You have to start at the local level. You have to start to discuss with local people to know what their priorities are, what their needs are, and so on. And as I said, the answers you will get will not all be the correct answers, and they will not all be converging answers. So you will need to go from there to another level and discuss with other people and discuss with other groups. And you will have to think yourself of the strategies you can use. And these strategies as well will be different from one community, from one country to another. So it is a. I personally do not think it all has to come from bottom up. It also has to come from the top. But it has to be a collective work where different groups can meet and discuss. Because programs like these social development goals that are just, given top down, cannot do it. So you have also to start from the bottom and make the discussions. And for the strategies, in an ideal situation, you will come up with, in the end, a kind of consensus on what you can do. I know this is very idealistic, but it's the way that you have to start from there and start with that dream and with that objective, I think. But you cannot say from the start, okay, you have a couple of principles and values. And even values can differ at a certain moment. But in that framework, your programs will be different from one country from one city to another.
Laura?
Yes, thank you so much, Francine. I was one of the people, many people here who was there last night as well. To be honest, I thought your presentation last night and today started out very tamely and expressing some pretty obvious social justice goals, as Cartwright has said. However, last night I thought you worked towards some more controversial, even radical ideas in today's debates about where we are going. And I think that they are the kinds of things that maybe we need to be talking about more amongst ourselves. And, you know, for example, it's pretty radical these days to talk about actually protecting and increasing our social programs, our social insurance programs, versus shifting to a discussion focused on individual income, whether it's basic income or poverty reduction programs that don't develop people's rights or social programs. So that's just, I guess, by way of comment. And I also just wanted to mention that as may have become obvious when people ask what is the ILO, ILO standards and social protections are not part of the discourse in North America. They are in Europe, they are in developing poor countries, as you know, but it's not a reality here. And I do have a question for you, which is, given the principles you've expressed, and last night you cited the social protections clauses that have been developed by the International Labour Organization, it seems to fly in the face of what's actually been happening inside the ILO with a lot of deregulation. We've been fighting in this city, in particular, and in other parts of the country, against what's happening with temporary help agencies, for-profit temporary help agencies. The original ILO said we need free, convention said we need free public services for employment standards. That got changed as employers weighed in at the ILO. On one hand, they're saying nice things, but it also seems, on the other hand, the ILO itself has been deregulating.
The ILO has no power to start with. It has a moral authority, that's all. Now, it is correct to say that in North America probably it has less influence than it has in Europe. But even there, even in Europe, the influence is limited. Again, it's only a moral authority, it's not a power machine. And it does not have the resources the World Bank and the IMF have, so they cannot impose their solutions. Secondly, the ILO is indeed a tripartite organization, which means that the employers are in, which means that all the texts, recommendations, conventions, whatever, are compromises. Now, I have nothing against compromise. We want maybe to go beyond, certainly. But if you want to work with employers, which you will have to do at any rate, it can be useful. Now, the principles in the text of the ILO are not rigorous ones. Of course, there has been, certainly in the past 2-3 decades, a neoliberal influence. I mean, the ILO does not live in another planet. So you have many texts where are written that we do not like, certainly not. But on the whole, I think that the ILO can be a very useful tool because the reality on the ground, and I guess, I'm not sure, but I guess it will not be that very different in Canada than it is in Europe. The reality is far worse. The reality in terms of labor conditions, the reality in terms of power of trade unions, the reality of labor conditions. So, personally, I think the ILO can be useful to refer to. Not in all cases, not as a universal principle, but on the whole, I think it remains useful. But we may differ on that, that's possible.
Back there?
Hi, I can speak. You mentioned cooperatives. I'm very interested in cooperatives, and I wondered your opinion, how they fit into your work or the social commons. How do you see cooperatives fitting?
Cooperatives are as useful and as strong or as weak as you make them. I mean, you make them and you define the rules, but you can't be perfectly capitalistic. You can't have perfectly capitalistic cooperatives. I don't have to tell you that. So it all depends on what you decide and what you want them to be. And that is correct as well, is true as well for the whole sector of social and solidarity economy. Because for some this is an economy for the poor, for some this is an economy that can go beyond, but I mean, you define the rules. And you will have to define the conditions with which they have to work. And what is important, I think, when you talk of cooperatives, of other forms of enterprises, what is now starting, which is very interesting, is a debate on the objectives of enterprises. Is it purely profit-making, or their social objectives, or their environmental objectives? Now, this is, of course, a very, very difficult debate. And we have seen in France, for instance, a debate had started, but it was immediately stopped by employers. By employers, by the enterprises themselves. So, but the seeds are there. I mean, we have to take them up and try to have this debate. And what is happening in Geneva now, it was, I think, the 4th year negotiations on the respect for human rights by multinational corporations, which is very important. Because you can, at a national level, all say we want to respect human rights, and then one of your global enterprises, especially in Canada with the mining corporations, they go to Peru, they go to Bolivia, or wherever, they go to Africa, and human rights disappear. So having rules for multinationals to respect human rights is extremely important, but it's a very, very difficult negotiation. But it is going on in Geneva. It was now for the 4th year.
You have someone, Joey, and then we'll come down here. Yep. Sheila Ricardo.
Hi. So at our table, I think there were a few of us who immediately kind of were struck by the idea of social commons not being new. That, as you had mentioned, that it's something that, we had always thought about in the work that we did. And in my experience in particular, in the developing basic income movement in Canada, one of our earlier partners sort of philosophies that have evolved from indigenous on up to everything have this idea of the commons. So it's not new and it's not foreign to most people, just thinking off the top of my head. We have been sold a bill of goods over the last 40 or 50 years that that is not the way the world works. It's about self-interest, not about the commons. And that when a lot of our social architecture was developed post-war, the conversation was different. There's a lot that was built up that was good, but it was still a lot of it based on a kind of, what was the sort of, you know, the difference between charity and justice. It was still sort of a supplicant model, like sort of doing something for people who are falling behind. And that's changed now too. So just, I don't know, if you want to reflect on that, because I think there's something there that resonates very broadly with people if it's, you know, described and involves people.
Can I ask a question related to that? Can you respond? Okay, let me ask a question related to that, because she lives with the basic income group. And I ask you because it follows up on Laurel's question as well, and some of the things you said last night that we struggle with here today. You know, we struggle with the notion about decent work and how to get decent work, how to keep it for people, younger generations being able to develop, you know, real stable paths forward, and income security. You know, and there is always the debate, you know, around basic income and the relationship between work and income. And you were very clear last night saying, you know, labor, you said, should be delinked from income, and larger notion of work. Could you just explain? Because if we're going to say come commonly to some approach to social justice that gives people decent standards of living that include enough income and interesting, rewarding things to do, if we have to have that common discussion, how do we struggle with this notion of delinking labor and income?
Thank you. I hope we can discuss this further today. Personally, I'm not an advocate of universal basic income, so let me say that from the start. I hope we can discuss different arguments today, so I'm not going into them.
Details.
But what I would like to say, and also answering the first reaction to what has just been said. Commons, social commons, I think, in the way that we have been developing it, is new, in the sense that what we are talking about is not a community-centered social protection where people help each other without having rights. The social commons we are talking about are in a rights framework, human rights. And of course people can help each other, and people should help each other. But to be very honest, I am getting old. If I am ill, I want professional help. Very simple. I do not want to depend on my neighbor. So we have to see it in a rights framework. And in that sense, this combination of, it is not basically based on help, it is basically based on rights and on participation, on democratization. So what we are talking about is a system where people have a say in what they want, in what their priorities are, in saying what their needs are. And in that sense, social protection as commons is new. Now, if I talk about rights, if I talk about people involved in deciding what their priorities and their needs are, this is a collective exercise. What social protection does This is my main argument against universal basic income. What social protection does is organize solidarity of all with all. I have a sickness insurance. It's an insurance principle. All pay, all contribute, and if you're ill, you get help. The same with pensions, the same with child benefits. So it is a collective system. It is a collective and horizontal structural solidarity. Whereas a universal basic income is a vertical solidarity from the state to the citizen, from the state to another citizen, from the state to another citizen. And what is lost is this horizontal structural solidarity. That is my main argument. The second point that you mentioned, and again I was happy to read it in one of Marvyn Novick's texts, is that we should not delink work and income. For many people defending basic income, it is to give people freedom. You're free. You have basic income security. So you're free, you can do with your life whatever you want. And most people will indeed get to work. Absolutely. Whether it is job, whether it is community work, whether it is family help, whatever. But most people will do. Now, one of my countrymen, Philip van Parijs, who is one of the basic advocates of basic income, also defends the point, this famous example of the surfer of Malibu. If you want to go surfing all day, that's your right. You are free to do that. Well, I think that is wrong. Because there is work to do in our societies. We have to work in order to survive, all of us. And I do not mean by that you need to have a job. But you need to eat. You need to have a roof on your head. And that socially necessary work, I think, has to be distributed over all members of society. And there is no one who can say, I don't. It's not a right to laziness. So I think we all have to take our part in the socially necessary work. And I very much like the idea that is now emerging and is now being defended by some people, mainly in France. We do not have to free people from labor. We all have to work. What we do have to do is to free labor from a capitalist logic. And that means that we can look at other forms of enterprises, like the co-operatives, like the social and solidarity economy. An economy that is not purely profit-oriented, that is not purely growth-oriented, that has social and environmental objectives. And in that way, you can redefine work. And there's this whole immense dossier of the reproductive work of women that has never been solved. And that we have to solve, because reproductive work is necessary for production. And it should be paid. So decommodification, as I said yesterday, is not the same as demonetization. But I hope we can discuss these points further today.
Last question here before I break.
Good morning. The question is more towards you for the broader room. I'm inspired by the way in which the plenary conversation was open. The acknowledgement of young people who are in the room. The conversation around how this concept of social commons ties to broader universal frameworks, labor frameworks. The point of my question is, what is the necessary qualities of the emerging leadership to take this work that has been evolving from one generation to the next, from one framework to the next, into a new dimension that is, I think, being proposed by this rights-centered social framework. So, with the young people who are taking up the mantle of social justice, the core question is, what do young people need in terms of skills, competencies, understanding, and space to challenge the existing frameworks to move them beyond the limitations? So if co-ops were once a wonderful concept that has proven to be just as adaptable to the broader capitalistic concept, what is the mindset, quality, and relationships needed for the emerging leaders to break beyond those trappings?
Let me first of all repeat something that has been said yesterday even in the panel. And that was that famous reference to the African principle of Ubuntu. I am because we are. And that means there are no individual solutions, first of all. And that is what young people have to know. They are not alone. They live in communities, they live in a society. So that is the very first principle. Do not look for solutions just for your own, because you will fail. Maybe some will succeed, but most of them will fail. The second thing is, it's not new, first of all, but it may not be traditional but we have this framework of human rights. That is nothing more than a tool. It is a strategic tool. Use it. We have, till now, and this is something we should never forget, till now there is not one government that dares say, I don't care about human rights. There is a global consensus on the importance of human rights, and we have to use that. They won't say, they will never say they don't want human rights, they will never say, they will never use the concept of social justice even. They will never use the concept of emancipation. These are words they do not use, they cannot manipulate, and therefore they do not use it. So use the concepts that are ours, first of all, that we can use, that we can bring to flourish, that we can really develop for young people. And from that level onwards, it is young people themselves who will have to say what kind of job they want, what kind of work they want to do, what kind of companies they want to work for. I mean, don't expect, again, that things are going to fall out of the sky. I mean, you have to develop this yourself. You have a universal framework that you can use. And I guess you have in Canada a constitution and laws that you can use, where there are values, where there are principles that you can use and should use. And from there, you have to develop your own needs and your own priorities. I hope that's the answer.
One final one quickly, Ricardo. Pardon?
Well, I also try and speak directly into this question. In relation to your point, I think there's a very palpable inconsistency between speaking about the commons and this collective pursuit, and to be emphasizing the language of human rights, which is in its very traditional, a liberal pursuit of individual rights, correct? And so much that civil and political rights have been able to be enforced, but we have failed miserably to enforce social and economic rights, because they're not about individuals, they're about collectives, they're about groups, they're about women, they're about class. And that language of human rights hasn't been able to address that, hasn't been very helpful in addressing that. So we're talking about social commons because we're talking about we should pursue things collectively, as individuals, and yet we're trying to go as the mechanism to allow us to do this, and I think the question should be more towards when do we start talking about collective rights, and when do we start talking about the failure of the social and economic rights featured in terms of human rights the way they have been since 1944.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much to Francine and to yourselves for the conversation and the questions you had. Appreciate it. So, we're going to have a little break, and you have on your name tags colored dot. Please, may I just have you attend for a second? Colored dot. I'm going to tell you where we're going next after the break. So, if you have a green dot, then you'll be at the back of the room with Franz Hartmann's group on environment and social justice. If you have a red dot, you'll be up here, we're going to rearrange a little bit here, the decent work and income security group with Wayne. Is Wayne here? Luchuk? Yep, he's going to be your chair. The Riel room is the Civic Commons group. David Miller.
Today's Louis Riel Day.
Today's Louis Riel Day.
Yay!
Well, we'll bring a bottle of champagne to that room or something. David Miller will be moderating that group. It's on the 3rd floor. Who's our planning group member? So Christopher Freiler is going to lead you in about 20 minutes up to the 3rd floor. It's not an easy route to find, but it's a big enough room. The Shad room is going to be led by Laurel. That's Protecting Social Services. It's down this hall to the left before the front doors. Don't go out the front doors. We want you back this afternoon. Take a 20-minute break. Thanks a lot.
So to have, sorry, I just realized there's another group and I have to bring my voice down. So the thought of eradicating everything so we could just have basic income, it doesn't cross my mind at all. That systems can stay. Now, I will argue that employment insurance is now broken. There are huge swaths of low-income workers who can pay out of their salary every week and can never claim it. If you're working 3 jobs and you lose one of them, you cannot claim EI on that job that you only worked 450 hours or 400 hours this year on. You cannot claim EI. So that's one that I'm not so sure of. Pensions, CPP, a little different. It's direct contribution with employers, supposedly a separate pool of money. For me, BI is a much less stigmatizing and a lot less intrusive system. So for someone with a disability like myself, I don't know how much you know about Ontario Disability Support Program, but it might surprise you to know that 78% of us are singles. And we remain single. Why? Because in 2019, if I live with someone for 3 months, they are now financially responsible for me, and their income gets deducted off of my disability support income, which is only $1,150 to begin with. So all these systems we have in place for policing people, based on perhaps a problem with a handful of people, has now ballooned into over 800 rules that confine people from moving forward in their lives. And it's ridiculous, and it needs to stop. That we spend more time administrating and policing on our current social assistance system than we do helping other people. And that's wrong. If we're going to have caseworkers, and no, we call them caseworkers, not social workers, then they should be able to go back to a trauma-informed lens of social work. And similarly, and I'm going to stop because I know you have another question coming. So similarly, when we look at things like even a feminist model of looking at social assistance. The idea that myself as a single, first understand that the country still relates to me as not in an economic family. That's Stats Canada's definition of a single. You won't find the word singles on their website. I'm not in a family, so somehow I already don't belong because I'm a single female. But also this idea that I become someone else's dependent, that I don't have autonomy as an individual, is deeply troubling. That this is still embedded in how we operate.
I'm a bit of a skeptic. I was involved some years ago in the City Summit Alliance, the modernizing income security for working age adults, and there's somebody here who was an expert at that time. But there was a huge fight within the steering committee. The folks from the corporate side who were involved in that desperately wanted us to walk away from employment insurance as a universal social program for people without work and move to a notion, I can't remember which was the institute at the time, that was talking about basic income. And I phoned a good friend of mine who was used to be a union researcher, now is a prophet at York, and worked it for years in the women's movement, trying to really think through constitution and law and how that supports equality. And she said, you just have to be a little careful, because this stuff could be like a mirage. You're walking to it because it looks fabulous, and you jettison all of the stuff that you've won through struggle, like employment insurance, like social security and other, and you're diverted back to this mirage, and when you get there, it may vanish.
A few people, very smart people, figured out how to create this economic system that makes a few people very, very rich, and most people are not. But to sustain that system, they had to infiltrate media messaging and the social media sort of bots. They had to create these magical economic theories that then they teach in business schools about trickle-down economics and all these things that are taught, and then everybody buys into it, right? Everybody believes, well, we're going to keep taxes, we're going to stimulate the economy, and like, there's all these kind of fake mythical theories that I fully believe somebody knew, was a farce, but needed that ideology to be ingrained in all of our brains in order for this system to operate as it does. And then this idea of consumerism, consumerism was kind of developed as a way of like placating people, and it fuels consumption, and it causes environmental degradation, but it also totally destroys our social fabric. And those are all key ingredients to keep this system functioning. And the erosion of democracy, right? You have built enough democracy up to placate people so that you're preventing revolutions. But then, when it gets too much, you start pulling it back because you need to, prevent people from actually having the agency to take down these systems. And then it has shaped culture, right? When we talk about things like, Kofi Hope talked yesterday about the fact that customer service in the city of Toronto is really terrible. Particularly for racialized communities and very marginalized populations, and that is what made people, what endeared Rob Ford to so many people, right? And that's true, I totally agree. But how did we get to a place in the first place where it's customer service, right? Where we moved, as Dr. Mestrum talked about, we moved from poverty, instead of sort of the social commons, we moved to this poverty reduction framework, and we've all bought into that. We've all bought into the idea that we need to be asking for more, making more asks and begging and for these crumbs. So like all of these different systems all kind of come together, and so I think that there's a big piece of work in kind of, in bridging the two, need to work on systems change and policy solutions and creating a new structure, but also the community, the people-centered community work. I think actually it's really important to bridge those two things, right? I think it's really important for groups like ours that work on the systems and the policies and all the structures that need to be addressed to be doing it in and through community. But I also think it's really important for the groups that like those hubs that are in community to be finding ways to link the community that they're building to this increased awareness about the system change that needs to happen, right? And in the environmental world, you know, we used to have all these conversations about, you know, if we get more people to take responsibility for their individual footprint, are we actually making the problem worse? Because we're distracting them and thinking, if I do my piece, I'm no longer focused on the system change, and really all of us here can do everything, recycle, never fly, whatever, don't use any plastic. The environment is still going to be completely destroyed because 70% of what you're seeing is actually not even caused by regular people like us. So I just think it's really important to design our work, whether you're a group like ours or a group that's directly doing service delivery and directly engaging communities, to always be bridging to each other.
Two, there is a really great consultation. I think it was great that Councillor Mike Layton did when I worked in his office. That might fit into this conversation. It was fun and different. There was an issue years ago of drinking in Trinity Bellwoods Park. And there were a lot of different opinions about the drinking that was happening in the park, and there were different types of people drinking. There were the people who lived on Bellwoods who would bring a blanket and go and sit in the park with their partner and their little kids, and they'd have a glass of wine, and they thought that was acceptable. And then there were the people who were younger, who live in apartments, who don't have backyards that they can sit in, and they went to the park as their backyard to drink. There's all different types of, this is a very complicated issue. There's an economy set up in the park around the bottle collection. And then there was what happened after 11 o'clock when it got a little out of hand. And there's different laws that could be enforced. There's the municipal bylaws around drinking in parks, and there were provincial laws about drinking in open spaces, which I'm not sure if those have changed. I couldn't really follow it. But this is really heating up in the community. And so Mike held a public meeting at Trinity Community Recreation Center where hundreds of people were coming out. And what we did was, the room was set up in rounds, and as people came in, we gave them a number to tell them what table they would sit at, because people come in with their friends and the people that they share a similar opinion with. And through that, and I'm sure we didn't know what we were doing, so I'm sure that Mass might have thought of a better approach there. Through that, though, we set up these tables so that they had everybody from a different kind of perspective and a different opinion sitting at those tables. And the police were also there. And they had this like Operation Green Goggles thing that they were doing at the time. Very interesting. But that whole meeting was set up so that at every table, the community built compromise with each other. And it was like the most diverse meeting I'd ever been to. Like across age too. Age, color, class, like everything was very diverse. Everybody was sitting at the table together. Homeowners, renters, and they each came up with, at these different tables, compromise that they then presented back to the room, and collectively, with like 350 people, we built a commitment. The community committed different things to each other, and it was really interesting, and people got to know each other. You know, they got to know each other across difference, which was neat. So I just want to put that out there, because this just reminded me of it. Progress Toronto is not a political party, and I say that not in defense of the organization, but also just in terms of the rules and the laws. So there's no way that we could be a political party. I don't know that we necessarily want to be. I think that we straddle the movement nonprofit, which are very different, but the movement nonprofit side and some of the things that a party does. So, for example, if you're in a political party and you're running for office, that party has central resources. It can communicate with you, right? We can't communicate with candidates if we're in the municipal election. Like, Progress Toronto would register in a municipal election as a third party and not coordinate with them and run parallel campaigns in support of them. So it's very different in that sense, right? Just like how we even operate, it makes it very different. But it is sort of like, I guess, like a progressive party, a labor party, as you were thinking, in the sense that we would like to have a bit of a pipeline from organizing and activism into actually taking power and seizing power, right? I think that's where you're thinking about it. And what happened in Barcelona is incredible, so people should really look that up. And it was, this is reducing it, but it was citizens and activists, residents who were tired of demanding things of government, and they got together and fought to actually take power, and they won, and they've been restructuring the government since then, and Ada actually got re-elected as mayor in May or June of this year too, so they have another term in front of them. And so we do definitely straddle that space. What was the question with it though?
In some ways we need to know where we want to go before we decide how to get there. So in short, talk a bit about the structures that need to change and basically the sort of ways in which they need to change. It's a nice simple question. Erin, why don't we start with you?
What comes to my mind right away is every day when I look in the mirror, I have to accept the fact that although I am an Indigenous person, I have white skin, and that gives me a lot of privilege, right? And it also allows me to go into spaces where Indigenous people of color are not, they're just not there, right? I look around the room, I don't see any Nietzsche's here, right? And yeah, so whenever I get invited to places, it is my responsibility to make space so that other people feel comfortable to come, right? Because I know for a fact that because if my skin is white, that's why I get invited to places. And so that's like the number one thing for me, is making sure that there's representation of people of color, of all different backgrounds, at every single level, no matter what system we're talking about. Whether it's the judiciary system, whether it's in the environment. My partner's Chinese, and he tells me all the time that when he goes to conferences or goes to work, that he feels that environmentalism is a white issue because he doesn't see other people that look like him there, right? And I always tell him, you just got to keep going and make sure you bring other people with you, because that's all that we can really do, right? And as we continue doing that, then there's going to become more representation. But it's also on the shoulders of those that have white skin to make sure that those places for people to have somewhere to be representation exist. And so that comes down to bringing in youth and having grant opportunities to allow people that can't afford to come to events like this to be able to be here.
Laura, you wanted to?
Yeah, I first want to address migrant workers. Under international human rights law, if you're here, the state has an obligation to serve you just as much as it does anyone else. International human rights law does not depend on citizenship. In fact, it addresses that directly in terms of mobility and being able to go to different countries and still be treated the same way. That solidarity in social commons, it goes back to what I said about bringing people to the table, the right people who are directly impacted by this. For me, basic income, or a minimum guaranteed income, I keep going back to the reading I did before I got here, will serve whatever need the market creates, right? So if we have a labor market that's going to employ people less and less, or we think we're an oracle and know exactly how it's going to go, I don't think any of us do, then we will need a security system. And that security system should be available for everyone. Our healthcare should be available for everyone. There shouldn't be that difference. And it's creating that power and momentum to change the law around it. And when I think of somewhere like Fort McMurray, I remember being in Calgary and being told that a receptionist starts at $99,000 in Fort McMurray, because a room with a hot plate was $3,000 a month. A room, shared washroom, you get a room. And I sat there and thought, is this really necessary? Are there no housing rules? Why are we not regulating that and putting standards in place? What happened to all the other rules in this new Wild West? And why aren't we creating them to keep up with this change in areas like that? So the state does have an obligation, and I think we should all be at that table going, what are you doing and when are you going to do it by?
On public learning, you know, I think this is maybe something that we used to do a little bit better, right? So one number that I really like, you know, in the last Parliament, of course, we had this national dialogue on electoral reform. Remember that? The government said they were going to spend $5 million of a national conversation on electoral reform. Yeah, I know everyone knows it was disingenuous, but just by scale, GM spends $150 million each year advertising its cars in Canada, right? So if you're serious about doing this stuff, you got to be doing it at a much greater scale. Now, there was maybe a kinder, gentler time in Canada where, you know, institutions like the National Film Board and others did a lot of broadcasting. You know, we have TVO for a reason. This is an instance of it. Hinterland's Who's Who, right? Because we wanted to get the sense of wilderness, right? It seems like Heritage Minutes are an instance of this now. But what we don't see is any kind of concerted effort. I think there are huge opportunities in the health system, right? You know, we're supposedly with these nutty Ontario health teams thinking about population-based care, good. So what do we want everyone in this catchment to know about their health or potential health stages? And then let's be serious about investing in that learning and then measuring it and seeing how it affects patient outcomes. There are lots of applications to this. One of my favorite public educators, a bit of a dated reference, Dave Nichols. Dave Nichols in the old Insiders Report.
I was thinking of different Dave Nichols. Sorry.
On Twitter? There's a reporter. But
Yeah.
No. This is the guy who used to be the front man for Loblaws, right? He was the President's Choice. And like, the old Insiders Report is not like today's grocery circular. They're crazy documents. It's like at 80 cents a day. It is packed with information. It's very political. It was one of the best read, most loved publications across all segments of society. And it's very countercultural because it used more words, not fewer, right? It's the best bathroom reading in the country. So public learning is actually really playful and it's pervasive. And there are lots of fun examples that we can learn from.
2 years ago, Guled Warsami, who's now the head of the Hotel Workers Union in Toronto, was sitting at a table with us talking about municipal politics and what had just happened with Uber and the city failing to regulate Uber.
Right.
And he said, you know, there's all kinds of young guys in my community, my Somali community, who've thought, wow, I can buy a car, I can impress the girlfriend, I can make money, you know, I'll be an Uber driver. And 4 months later, leave because they realize they're actually making less than minimum wage. And that is part of the impact of the disruptive technologies that's going to touch on everything. So the question, and of course now, UFCW is trying to organize Uber workers, the postal workers are trying to organize Foodora workers. So there are organizing attempts. When you think about workers who don't have a boss, I described construction workers earlier on, but I just want to also touch about our actors and entertainers. They're all self-employed. They have a union called ACTRA. They negotiate broad framework agreements with producers, and they're looking at you know, distributive media work. They're trying to create a framework around which that undertaking is rewarded. What's the compensation for your intellectual knowledge, your talent? It's not blue-collar pipe fitter. It's a whole different world. And we had a conversation 3 weeks ago with the head of the German trade union movement talking about how we deal with the future of work or work of the future. And he kept referencing the European system of decrees, where a union bargains with the state the value of cleaners' work is $18 an hour plus benefits. The value of couriers' work is this. The value of temp agency workers in warehouses is this, and the state decrees that is the rule. Now, of course, there's going to be companies getting around it by using undocumented workers, migrants, and others. But a piece of that solution is the food and commercial workers again. In the meatpacking industry in Alberta, where they were bringing in TFWs because the wages were terrible, and nobody wants to really slaughter, cattle for a career choice. The union negotiated a requirement that the employer supported the application of that TFW for the provincial sponsored program to become a Canadian citizen as a right of employment. And let me tell you, it's pretty goddamn easy to go and organize on non-union workplaces. If TFWs from the Philippines or North Africa are there and you're saying, we can help you become Canadian, as part of this right of employment, as part of our collective values. So I think there's elements of these experiences. A decree system, there the state dramatically imposes restrictions on the market, on the role of collective workers saying, I may have been here 10 generations, but that person that's going to be working beside me, I want to make sure they have the same rights as I do. And of the role of taxation and the role broadly around a social safety net that is part of a society. So those are other elements I wanted to add in. And I do want to also actually honor Grace Edward, because he was part of the original framing of the Good Jobs for All coalition that we did back in 08 and 09, and having folks who are intellectuals working with people like me. I started my trade at the age of 18, working with with people who came as refugees, shaping this future. I mean, that's what gives me optimism about we can build the kind of Canada and the world we want, one step at a time.
With over 20 years of frontline research and policy experience, Leila understands that the people experiencing the most significant barriers are often the furthest away from decision making. Her professional experience demonstrates commitment to connecting lived reality with public policy and advocating with and engaging people in meaningful ways to inform policy and legislative changes. Among other accomplishments, Leila is a recognized leader in influencing the City of Toronto to integrate an intersectional gender analysis in its policy work. I could go on, but I'll just keep it short. But importantly, Leila is an avid city cyclist who lives, volunteers, and raises her children in Parkdale.
I'm actually very, very honored to be here. I was told 10 minutes over lunch, and now I feel like it's a bit more than that, so I hope that this goes well. But I am very honored. I will say that it has been almost exactly 30 years to the date since the federal all-party resolution to end child poverty was signed in 1989, and they wanted to end it by the year 2000, which is how Campaign 2000 got its name, and now it's 2019, and we're still very, very far away. That's a bit of a spoiler alert for my presentation, which I'll share with you the findings of a report that we released in mid-September that mapped out the rate of child poverty by federal riot. And so last night, I was able to listen to Francine speak, and she started the discussion last night with asking, what is poverty? How do we conceptualize and understand poverty? How do we define it? And that has real implications for people and public policy. And one of the ways it has implications is in how we measure poverty. And last year with the Canadian Federal Poverty Reduction Strategy, the government said we now have an official poverty line, which is the market basket measure. And the market basket measure costs out some essential goods and services that people need. So there's 5 categories: shelter, food, housing, clothing, and a category of other basket of goods and services, you're not considered to be living on low income. If you can't afford it, then you can't afford that threshold, then you're living on low income. There's some very significant challenges with this measure, and this way of measuring. It's not costed out for the territories and the reserves, which have some of the highest prevalences of child poverty. And when I think about social commons and who is included, and last night the discussion was a lot around how do we identify with others and have empathy and include them in our social commons, and who are the others that we don't identify with and get excluded. And this is yet another way that Indigenous communities keep getting excluded from anti-poverty work. It's very subjective, the things that go into the basket and what's considered essential, and doesn't always account for cultural differences. The basket hasn't been updated since 2010, so it really underestimates the prevalence and the rate of poverty, and it reflects only the material deprivation component. So Campaign 2000, as we do our analysis, we use the low income measure, which is based on tax filer data from 2017, which is the most recent. This is the 2016 numbers up here. About 95 to 97% of Canadians file, and you can see the discrepancy between the market basket measure, which is the lower line, and the low income measure against tax filer data, which is the higher line. And those children who are in the middle won't be eligible for services programs, even though their families may still be struggling to make ends meet. And so in our report, Child Poverty by Federal Writing, the work ahead for Canada's next government, we worked with actually the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and they helped us to create this interactive map. It's not interactive here, but if you go on our website, you can scroll over the ridings, and it'll show you the rate of child poverty. If you click on a riding, it cross-references 2016 census data, certain variables, so you can see who is living in that riding. So the data in this map is organized into 5 equal groups called quintiles, ranging from lowest to highest prevalence of child poverty. The highest, or the 5th quintile, comprises of ridings with child poverty ranging from 24.4% to 63.6%. Those are all those really deep red areas on the map. And ridings in this group included nearly 1/3 of all low-income children in Canada in 2017 and had an average child poverty rate of 32%. The first quintile on the map is comprised of ridings with the lowest prevalence of child poverty and is represented by the yellow colors, and the poverty rates in those quintiles range, in the lowest quintile range from 5.4% to 13% in 2017. So what we're saying is that every riding across the country still has very significant numbers of child poverty, every riding. We looked at the numbers between 2015 and 2017 to look at the change in rate, and we did find an important downward trend in the rate of child poverty. We heard during the federal elections, Justin Trudeau talking about 300,000 children being lifted out of poverty, and this is the rub he's using the market basket measures. When we ran the numbers, we found that it was 134,000 children lifted out of poverty according to the low income measure. I'll just go back. We know that, and we heard actually in I was in one of those small group sessions, that our country is becoming more urbanized, and poverty is concentrated in urban centers, but we also find significantly high rates of poverty in rural areas, and there is a rural riding that continues to be, has the highest percentage of children living in poverty. The number, every time I think about it, it blows my mind, but it has 21,750 children who lived in poverty in 2017, and that was despite a 3.5% decrease in the rate since 2015. So pretty astounding. And Winnipeg Centre also is in one of the top 5 of ridings in the country that has highest rates of child poverty. And this is a zoom-in of the ridings around Winnipeg, and it's illustrating the inequality as well. You have right in the center the really dark red ridings with high rates, right neighboring the first quintile of the lowest rates. And in Toronto, where we are at, even at a riding level, we see that 14 out of the 25 federal ridings have the highest rate of child poverty, and it's also illustrating the trend of child poverty moving up into the York region and over into Mississauga with levels of really high rates of child poverty in those geographic areas. And so for Campaign 2000, we say that we cannot only be satisfied with decreasing child and family poverty in general. We must ensure that the decreases are equal or larger for groups with disproportionately high rates of poverty, and that includes Indigenous people, racialized people, children and parents with disabilities, lone parents and sole mothers, and recent immigrants. Campaign 2000 sets out a series of bold ambitions and aggressive policy changes to improve the labor market and eliminating poverty, to enhance income support programs at the federal and provincial levels, to provide universal access to high quality public services, including housing, childcare, healthcare, and supports to civil society in its poverty prevention and poverty reduction activities. We ground our work in the human rights framework with the goal of ending poverty for all, and we advocate for tools such as intersectional gender-based frameworks that help us develop local and place-based indicators and mechanisms for ensuring that we're on the right path to ending child poverty. Thank you.
And it's good to see it broken down to our neighborhood level, because I guess if we're ever going to really do something like we've been trying in Campaign 2000 around policy impacts, I think we've had some success. It's cross-community, community by community, getting together behind shared objectives and goals, and holding feet to the fire around policy change that needs to happen. So appreciate this presentation. Our next session is going to be, again, Brigitte and David and our group, David Westein, is that what's in our group, really thought it important that we try to cast our eyes forward around the possibilities of taking these notions and actually working together and implementing them, or discovering what their weaknesses are that we need to reinforce. And we wanted to do it from the point of view of younger generation, as opposed to kind of some of us in the room who've been around a bit longer. And so we asked 4 young people, 5 younger leaders, to cover the 4 topic sessions that we had, and they're going to next be up here, and Joey Edward is going to moderate that session.
So I would ask the panelists to please join us at the table. This morning we talked about her constant lunches with Marvyn Novick, and she talked about how they met and they rubbed and polished each other's brains. Well, my guess is that most of us right now are feeling that our brains have really been rubbed and polished over the morning, and certainly yesterday. If I just forget what I'm talking about here, it's rubbing and polishing. So again, my name's Joey Edward, and I'm a member of the Marvyn Novick Legacy Planning Group, and will be your moderator for this wonderful session. This session really has 2 facets to it. We have asked the panel, who have attended their respective workshops, sessions this morning, to reflect a little bit on what were the salient points, what came out, what were your discussions, and just take a few moments. What are the takeaways of those discussions? we've asked them from their vantage point, from their place, to tell us what they think about, to reflect a little bit on the social commons. And is it useful or isn't it useful? Is it a possible paradigm? Is it a tool? Is it a process of commoning to move us collectively and collaboratively towards an Ontario in Canada that looks very different? I'm talking about a Canada where social and climate justice are understood simply as a shared struggle to fundamentally change our system of social protection, our economic system, the nature of our economy, and our understanding of the gifts and the limits of our planet. And then second, I will invite our guest, who I'm sure is very tired, long trip from Mexico, very different climate, to share some, Francine, some of your final just observations or thoughts with us, and you know, some of maybe your thoughts on the thoughts of our panel and from last night's panel also. I know that, and then I would close this session with two what I consider important announcements from the Marvyn Novick Legacy Planning Group. And that will allow us to wrap up our afternoon, and let's see where we go from here. So now I'm going to the first part, Future Forward panel. And I will introduce our colleagues just as they begin to speak. And our first speaker, and then after they speak, I'll open it up for your comments, your questions, your interviews. Ausma attended the session on decent work and income security in the social commons framework. Now, Ausma is the Director of Social Engagement at the Atkinson Foundation. She hosts the Foundation's Just Work It podcast, really this generation's perspective on decent work. She also had worked at Queen's Park and was and worked as a director of campaigns for the Stephen Lewis Foundation. She also was a Toronto District School Trustee between 2000, I know, John, you're going to hear this, the school trustee between 2014 and 2018. She's a lifelong human rights activist. So we look forward to your comments.
Thank you very much. Is this good? Can everyone hear me? No, I'm just talking really loudly, so it sounds like it's on. Is that better? No. Yeah, all right. Gotta hold it down, but I don't think it's working.
No, it's not working.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Is that better? All right, great. Thank you very much. Thank you for that kind introduction, and as was mentioned, my name is Ausma Malik, and I'm the Director of Social Engagement at the Atkinson Foundation. And I have prepared some notes for today, so bear with me. I love looking at your beautiful faces, and I will also be referring to my notes. It's really been an amazing day so far to be in such fantastic company, and also I think to, the mic didn't agree, to be in such great company, and also through being here, get a better sense of Marvyn Novick's legacy. And sadly, I never had a chance to meet Marvyn in person. How many of you have? That's incredible, and that's incredibly fortunate. And I only know him from his scholarship and his contribution to public policy and his history with the Atkinson Foundation, actually. And Atkinson really is grateful for the chance to have worked in the Commons and for the Commons with him and with so many of you that I've gotten to catch up with and see throughout the day, so thank you. And for me, I guess the more that I've had a chance to learn and know and dig into Marvyn's work, I know I would have liked him a lot. And he would have been a kindred spirit because of his deep devotion to the well-being of future generations and to ensure that all children and their families thrive in our city, in our province, and in our country. And this past spring, Atkinson convened a book launch, and I would kind of be able to say now, maybe in Marvyn's spirit, for Mary Jo Letty and her newest book, Why Are We Here? Are folks familiar with this book? No. Yeah, well, it's a great book, and Mary Jo is pretty formidable and inspiring, isn't she? Absolutely. She's an educator, a theologian, a social activist, founder of Romero House for Refugees, and of course, an author. And at this event, we brought together people whose faith, activism, and commitment to community intersect, and who share the commitment that we have in this room to the Commons. And of course, the title question of Mary Jo's book, Why Are You Here? I have this on my shelf at work, so I see it like almost every day, is one that is difficult for any of us to shake if we are aware and paying attention to an increasingly troubling world and more uncertain times. But it's the question that Mary Jo asks after that big question that resonated with me. She asks, what do we hold in common? It's a big question for all of us. But then she offers, we hold a street in common, a neighborhood, a city, a village, a vastness. We are not owners, but inhabitants of this place. And when I heard that, my mind immediately turned to the sky and the ocean when I imagined what it means to be an inhabitant in a place. I'll share a little bit with you about me. Growing up, my older brother and sister were amateur astronomers and oceanographers in the making. And as the youngest in my family at the time, I wanted to be in on their expeditions. You know, from visits to the planetarium to watching the nature of things every Wednesday night, I was right there. And what fascinated me most about the sky and the ocean was that they, like the land, can be held in trust, you know, safeguarded with laws and norms, but they are a thing that we hold in common. And of course, air and water, they're life-giving. And as I've grown up, I've realized that we are all in search of meaning, whether we find it in the study of stars in the sea, or in moments of quiet reflection, as Mary Jo talks about, or in daily work. And I've come to understand the Commons as a resource or a space where we find and make shared meaning and purpose. It's where we first discover the truth, the reality of our connectedness, or as what another theologian calls our quantum entanglements. Now, what happens to the human spirit when it's denied access to places where inclusion, equity, diversity, and belonging can be experienced? I heard a lot of theories in our conversations today about what happens. And even more so, the question about what are the consequences of shrinking the commons and expanding the private domain. And that is something that we got to touch on in the panel that I sat in on decent work and income security. And what I heard was that some of the consequences that were raised were the increasing commodification of the basics of living actually do harm to all of us, especially those from historically excluded communities. And it's not just even harm, but they actually have life-robbing consequences. And you know, the story of the temporary workers at Fiera Foods who have been demanding protections, and that's fallen short again and again was raised. Another consequence is that we have weakened social solidarity that pits us against each other along generational, racial, immigration, and gender lines, just to name a few, to our detriment and to the benefit of the few. Another consequence that I think is something that has really characterized so many of our conversations in the day is that it exacerbates our inequality. and erodes our democratic power in society, but also our democratic power in workplaces by putting up high barriers to access to ways that we do rebalance power, like unionization. This morning and last night, Francine shared with us this idea that work and income do not have to be delinked. People do not have to be freed from labor. On the contrary, it is labor itself that has to be freed from capitalistic logic. And in our panel, the idea was also raised that I think was shared in a very clear way, is that the commons has to embrace decent work, and that workplaces need to be commons. Maybe they were once, and they need to be again. Those connections that we have, the community that we create, the purpose that we hold in a workplace are essential to the best of what we want to see in the commons. And today we've been talking about the future of the commons, and I'm really excited to hear more from my fellow panelists about that too. And we're already seeing a future that is different than the past because of three big things in my view that I'm going to share with you. The first is an aging population and changing demographics. We need everyone to fulfill their potential, and millennial workers can expect to have a lot of responsibility on their shoulders, seeing the right direction things are going. Technology was the second piece, and something that has come up in a lot of the conversations too. And the advent of technology, and millennials like me are engaging in the digital commons even more than we might be in the commons that we envision at like Nathan Phillips Square. But technology has also demonstrated the potential to be a powerful tool to drive movements and reinforce what is worth protecting about the commons rather than what isolates and divides us. And the third thing that makes the future already different is the destruction wrought by the climate crisis. The future has to be greener, more just, more conscious of climate consequences today and going forward than it has been in the past. It is also an unprecedented opportunity to make a just transition to a healthier and more sustainable environment, a more prosperous and equitable society and economy with decent work and fairness at its core is possible through that. And someone said this earlier today, so I think it was in our panel discussion, maybe it was Adriana, but the past, but as in the past, the future will be what we decide to make it today, right? Our choices, our actions today have consequences. As you know, I'll talk about it to anyone, but I host Atkinson's Just Work It podcast about our generation's relationship to work. And in our most recent series on the future of work, we had a live event that kicked it off at the beginning of the year. And at that event, we posed the question, what are you doing today to make the future of work more brilliant for everyone, not just a caricature? And in our newest episodes, that will be out soon, I talk to decent work activists and advocates about their actions to this big end. And they talk about liberating, delivering, validating, legislating, organizing to make tomorrow different than today. To draw on what is essential about the commons and let go of everything else to make the future that is, and this is something, these are qualities of the future that we want to see that I heard throughout the day, but was also really beautifully encapsulated in the complex conversation we had on the panel. And that's a future that is equitable in every way, where climate justice, racial and indigenous justice, and gender equity are built in, not an afterthought, where we build power with each other in order to rebalance it, and a future that is free of exploitation, and where decent work and a dignified life are possible for absolutely everyone. So I'm going to leave you with this. Maybe what's more important than the frame we use to define the commons is that everyone can identify the common places, the shared spaces, the marketplaces, the social relations that we're ready to defend and expand. Maybe what matters is how we're organized across different interests, experiences, and causes to achieve a lot of different things. And I am going to take this opportunity to give a shout out to folks who are in this room who are working to make work decent, to ensure everyone has a home, to guarantee universal child care. Martha Friendly and Carolyn Burns are here in this room. Let's give them a round of applause. To create racial justice, and I know Nathan Shan and the Urban Alliance on Race Relations has been doing that for so long, and let's give them a round of applause. There's folks who are working to achieve health equity, and I'm not sure if she's still here, but I saw Trish Hennessy here earlier, and the work that she's doing with Upstream and has been doing in the research work over such a long time is working to achieve that. To make the planet safer, more sustainable, and just, and I know that there is a strong contingent of folks from the Toronto Environmental Alliance, and MMA, the executive director, was on a panel as well, so let's give it up for them too. To implement a just transition, and of course, one of the first people I saw when I got here was Laurel Ritchie and the Good Jobs Coalition and the work that they've been doing over such a long time, so thank you. And the folks, and I think we're all participating in this in so many different ways, but the folks who are working to invigorate our democratic power, I'm going to give a shout out to Progress Toronto, and I know Michal Hay was here earlier and on a panel as well, but just bringing together so many folks in common cause to make that concrete change as well. And I know that there's so many other people who are working on so many different issues, and that's just one snapshot of what our movement looks like. So please, like I said, you've heard some of those folks on the panel today, but what I know is that you can see all of you and them on the ground every single day, and please follow them on the digital commons or wherever you find them. Wherever we're located, where we live and work and play and vote and learn, but especially in this moment and in this time and place, our main task is to embrace the visceral, often heartbreaking and essential experience of being in the commons, and to be able to live that and breathe that and embody that in every way that we can. Thank you very much. And I look forward to this.
Wow, our brains are still being massaged. Our next presentator is at the other end of the table, and that's Erin Hayward. And Erin attended the session on integrating social and environmental justice. So Erin is a Mohawk and a mixed European woman of the Turtle Clan, and traditionally from 6 nations of the Grand River Territory. She is a ceremonial helper and also a teacher, not professor, as she said in the session, a teacher of environmental sciences at Flemington College in Peterborough. She's also a member of the Laidlaw Foundation's Youth Indigenous Advisory Committee, and she has just finished a master's degree in environmental and life studies.
Sego Seo Guego, that's how you say hello everybody in Ganyageha. I am Ganyagehaga. Most of you might know that as Mohawk. I am Haudenosaunee. Most of you might know that as Iroquois. So my people were given names when other people came here, but we have names for ourselves. And I think that's important because everybody has their own identity. You have your own self. And to have yourself acknowledged in the way that you ask is very important. I'm part of the Turtle Clan, and that's a responsibility that is passed down to me. And as part of the Turtle Clan, we are told that we are the history and the wisdom keepers, and that is our responsibility to keep that going for the next 7 generations. In many of our teachings, we are told that everything that we have today is because of the 7 generations that came before us. And everything that we do today will affect the 7 generations that come after us. And so I think that teaching that is passed down to us is very relevant when we talk about the social commons, because the conversations that we have in this room today will affect our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, our great-great-grandchildren, our great-great-great-great-grandchildren, and it keeps going. So that panel that we had earlier, I think for me, like in Indigenous ways of knowing and thinking, we're always taught that your brain is only going to hold on to what you're ready. And so I really hate summarizing conversations because, you know, my brain is only picking up on what I was ready to learn in that moment. And so some of my fellow panelists really touched on some stuff that I thought was incredible words, and I want to acknowledge their words because without them, that conversation, it would have just been me. And I think having them beside me allowed me to be able to touch on things that I wouldn't have been able to think of in that moment. And one of my panelists really talked about that feeling of self, and that the social commons begins with us. And from there, it will slowly trickle out into those communities that we're all part of, those small networks that we have and we have influence over. And through that trickling out, hopefully one day, the social commons will eventually affect the rest of society. And that society that we live in right now, it's very different from the society that used to be here. And the social commons actually is a way that is helping to bring our society back to the way society was before people came here. And in Indigenous communities, we have our own legal systems, we have collective law, we have individual law, we have environmental law. And I think that being able to know that those things do exist, we don't have to invent anything that's new, because cultures all around the world have had individual, collective, and environmental law for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And it's just a matter of really, you know, reaching out to those people and saying, hey, we've lost our way and we need help. And so, yeah, that's really all that I can think of for summarizing right now. For me, like, in my realm right now, as being a teacher at Fleming College, I'm constantly working against the structures that are in place. And many of those structures really do go against Indigenous ways of knowing and teaching. It goes against our worldview. I constantly have to correct students because they will say, humans and the environment. Humans are the environment. And I think until we manage to show society that humans are not at the top of a pyramid, we do not have authority over the world. All this flooding that is occurring all around Ontario and all around Canada, we can't control it. We just have to adjust to it. And part of the social commons and part of, you know, being a community, being able to listen to each other, and not all, my microphone's going. So being able to listen to each other, we don't always have to respond. When I'm in a group of people, I usually like to just sit and listen. I don't actually like to be the one talking, which is funny because I'm a teacher. And so the idea of the social commons being able to bring people together and allowing those people that just want to listen, that's what they can do. It's fine to do that. And then having those people that are really good talkers, you know, like, you are an amazing speaker. I'm like, oh my God, how am I supposed to follow that? But yeah, like, being able to give people that are really great speakers the opportunities to share what's in your mind, because it's really a wonderful experience for everybody else to be able to expand our minds. and to be able to see a world that once existed but can exist again. I'm not really sure if you want me to keep talking, but I think that's all I've got for now. Y'all go up. Thank you.
So our next speaker was pole vaulted into her role at the table today. Unfortunately, Tiffany, who was going to address us, is sick and was unable to travel from Peterborough. But we have Anita Khanna, and Anita works with today the National Director of Public Policy and Government Relations for the United Way Centre of Canada in Ottawa. But most of us in this room probably know her as the past National Coordinator of Campaign 2000 and Director of Social Action at Family Services Toronto. So Anita, I know you love Toronto and I know you're loving Ottawa, and thank you for joining us on the panel.
Thank you. So, yes, I came in this morning to register, and of course when I arrived I heard, we have a job for you. So I'm here, I was happy to go to the panel. I got into my first choice. I'm happy to do my best to summarize what I heard. And it was a very interesting panel with a lot of different perspectives, I think, but in my reading of what people were talking about, the big theme was talking about power, whether it was about naming inequity in power, about sharing power and building power across communities, about diffusing it, and ultimately building it across our different neighborhoods in our communities. So there's like 4 summary points that I wrote up. So the first piece was around diffusing power, sharing and diffusing leadership, and also letting go of power and being okay with that in order to build the notion of the civic commons. There was also a lot of talk about the need to engage in meaningful democratic engagement, where we get over the fact that we can't predict the outcome of community engagement, that we don't sort of set up things to give us the answers we already know or that we want to hear, that we're actually we're recognizing people have the true voice and they have meaningful, smart things to bring to things, and getting over that assumption that people don't have knowledge or understanding of how city processes work or how institutions work, and letting go of that, and recognizing that communities do hold solutions and do have visions for what they'd like to see. We also had an interesting discussion around promoting public learning more, right? So if there are areas where communities need to learn more about how processes work or what the right solution is, what is the role we can take in education and building knowledge to build power? How do we build knowledge on public assets? How in that process are we mindful of what the truth is, or what is right, or what is the solution? And how do we also keep in mind whose knowledge is being valued, whose knowledge is being centered, and how that kind of information or that learning is contained into boxes, and how do we turn that public learning and knowledge into mobilization? And there were examples. We talked about participatory budgeting at the City of Toronto and different experiences with that. We also talked about Progress Toronto's great work around public learning on City Hall and TDSB 101s on how to build power and influence politicians, for example, and how to persuade power, which I think was very powerful to hear about. And Ethan, Sean was on the panel. My first boss in Toronto. He always brings something good to the table when he's coming. He's talking to people in our sector and who are engaged in the kind of organizing that we're all engaged in together. And we were reflecting on the context in the morning where there was a bit of discussion around how many of us, we get the Commons framework. We're working on this, like this makes sense to us. We feel that this is something that we're familiar with. And he, in his powerful way, he reminded us to take the opportunity to look deeper within the movements that we're building and the movements that we're part of, to see as social justice advocates what we are really living and how we are sharing power and talking about inequities within our communities. What are we reproducing? You know, can we take an opportunity to reflect on our movements, what they look like, who speaks when, whose ideas are valued, all those kinds of things, and how can we do and be ourselves better, right, in order to build the vision of the world that we talk about, right, one that is equitable, one that is not divided by race or gender or class division, and how do we check or recheck ourselves in that process, I think was a very valuable contribution to the conversation as well. The fourth thing that came up that was really interesting in our conversation during the panel was around the definition and understanding of social commons. And it was really interesting to hear how different people interpret the concept and are still, I think, obviously have much to learn about the depth and the different definitions within it. And there was a conversation around private sponsorship of Syrian refugees, right, which was a plank of the last federal mandate, and a situation in which there were 25,000 people sponsored by, you know, private groups who raised money to support settlement within their communities. And there were sort of two different perspectives on that situation that came up. So one was like, isn't that a great demonstration of the power of the social commons? Right? Isn't that that was one perspective, isn't that something that shows that when we collaborate, we build power, we can do something to collectively support people? And the other perspective that sort of came up was like, well, sort of like, was the government outsourcing that responsibility? What if we had collectively paid our taxes towards actually supporting community services and making them healthy and robust enough so that we don't have crises and deep poverty among people who we brought to Canada to find the social safety net frayed to the point where they could fall through, right? So it was an interesting moment. I bring up the discussion not to cause debate and division, but mostly, but maybe that's good, because the next thing I'm going to say is that it was a very good moment of seeing and hearing people have and share different perspectives on an issue, and the way we're going to work out things and build the social commons is by talking about it, right? And learning from each other and hearing from one another. And I think it was just a really interesting note for us to end on, and to have that moment where people, you could see people sort of rethinking their perspective, hearing from each other, and moving forward. I think Francine remarked on that in the morning, right? That sort of, we won't get it right the first time, we might not get it right the second time, but there's a value in working it out together. So that's the panel. And anyway, I was happy to be there. Happy to be around like all that great thinking that I know and has raised me a little bit in the city of Toronto, which I really appreciate. I tried to write down some points about things that I see in the social commons, the questions that I have as well. And I think that theme that I raised when I referenced Ethan's remarks, of course, was around who's included, you know, whose voices are part of shaping the social commons. How do we not reinvent the structures that we want to dismantle within our movements? I think is really interesting. When I was listening to Francine speak this morning, we used the term universalism. And when I was sitting in the corner, I was thinking, okay, like there's this thing happening now at the federal level where we talk about quite a lot about targeted universalism. Let's talk about it. And it was interesting because during our panel, someone used targeted universalism as a reference to an equitable approach to community building. So in the sense that, you know, universal one fits all doesn't work often for people who need greater supports or face greater barriers, right? So so there's this sort of, at the level of discourse, which you talked about yesterday, words that have meaning and words that become objects, what do we do with that term? And what is the approach in social commons to sort of this discussion? I think is an interesting concept. Maybe bring it up. And then I'll end on two other sort of points or ideas that this whole discussion has raised for me. So we talked a bit about, in the morning as well as last night, about human rights as a framework for building social commons, and I was reminded of work that I did
with Campaign 2000, and I continue with United Way, which is around building on decades of work to recognize the right to housing within Canadian law, which is something that became legislation on June 21st, 2019, right before Parliament ended, closed up shop for the election. So, and I wanted to draw on this example or bring it up because it was and is a recent example and one that has yet to sort of be populated and operationalized of largely people with lived experience of homelessness and housing precarity for years talking about the fact that there is a lack of access to housing, that there are rules stacked against people, there's lack of government action, etc., and really organizing themselves around the right to housing. And in the last couple of years, really, there has been an opportunity to have that right recognized in law. And in my experience of working with the advocates through the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, Canada Without Poverty, the Maytree Foundation, and others, there was a real lack of willingness to back down from any of the elements that would make the right to housing in Canada meaningful. And when I say that, there was a commitment to ensure that we would have a housing advocate who would hear the experiences of people whose right to housing was violated. And then the second piece was around making sure that there will be a housing council that is made up largely of people with lived experience of poverty, and of homelessness and housing precarity. And that group would be representative of everyone impacted by those factors. So I raised these examples and thinking through a little bit of what Francine was talking about the need for a human rights approach to a lot of issues. This came to mind. I think the work's not done there. I learned from speaking to Elizabeth McIsaac before she left that the City of Toronto is very close to adopting a right to housing, or they've adopted or accepted a right to housing framework. But there's some opportunity to start up a bit of an office and do that kind of work, and that's a decision that's coming up in the next few weeks or perhaps a couple months. So it's something that people on the ground who are interested in this topic could be perhaps activate on and be involved with as that comes up. And I'll end there. Thank you.
And our last panelist, Ricardo Tranjan. Ricardo attended the session Protecting the Social Commons, Taxes, Services, and Government. So Ricardo is a political economist and senior researcher at the Canadian Centre for Social Policy Alternatives in their Ontario office. This is where his work focuses on Ontario finance, public finance, educational funding, and poverty reduction. Actually, before he started at the CCPA, Ricardo was the manager of the City of Toronto's poverty reduction strategy. He holds a PhD from the University of Waterloo, and his academic publications include a book on participatory democracy in Brazil, socioeconomic and political origins. Ricardo.
Thank you. Locate your cup of coffee. This is the political economist talking about the expenditure segment. Trust me, you will need it. Keep it close. So as part of the CCPA crew, I evidently participate in a lot of fiscal policy debates. And one of the things that kind of concerned me is that often these debates are framed in rather transactional ways. And even by folks like us who are advocating for progressive tax measures. So the question that I want to address here, drawing on the panel earlier this morning, is whether the social commons language helps us to find a better balance between promoting a value-based vision and showing how we can achieve it.
and showing how we can pay for it. So that's in general what I'm going to focus on. So what do I mean by the transactional terms? Whenever I have folks talking about budget and fiscal policy and tax measures, very often and very soon, the focus is on how much we can increase, by how much can we increase the income personal tax rates and the corporate tax rates versus the tax sales rates, and what are the loopholes, and how can we close those, what are the mechanisms to close those loopholes, and if we do that, how much revenue we generate, and then what can we buy in terms of public services with that revenue. If we are going to invest in this or that program, how much money additional we would need in order to the right threshold, because if we increase the threshold, more people are qualified, therefore we need a higher tax rate, so to actually fund sufficient funds to pay for it. So get me, the conversation very, very quickly gets to that kind of level of details. And that is important, and I think we often open our arguments and close our arguments with a social justice or with a value-based argument. But the rationale that we put forward is often in the economist's terms, right? So I'll give you a few examples. For a while, we used the language of social returns on investment. That's what we felt we needed to do to make our point. Sometimes we talk about the cost of inaction or the cost of poverty, thinking about the great work John and others did. When we're talking about education funding, it doesn't take long for us to start arguing in terms of employment and economic growth and the kind of returns we're going to have. And when we're talking about the health investments, we also often will fall into the trap of talking about savings, the downstream savings. We're investing in health now, we're going to save money later, and that's a great return, and that's what we should be doing. And I'm not criticizing their work. I have made all of those arguments myself, both in my work within the city, and now as a researcher at the CCPA. And at the moment, when you're right there, it feels the right thing to do, because it feels strategic, it feels like it can give us what we need for like the next policy win, and it makes sense. And that's why we do it, and that's probably why we're going to continue to do it. But when you take a step back and look at our work combined, and we see how much time and energy and resources we spent just justifying what we're trying to put forward, trying to make sure that the numbers add up and that we don't sound like pie in the sky leftists or whatever. It's a lot of energy, it's a lot of time, it's a lot of resources. And so the question is, can we balance that better? Can we make it our point, our value-based points more straightforwardly and more robustly? So in that sense, the panel was very interesting in this morning, because Trish, she kickstarted the panel by asking everyone, what kind of Canada do we want? That was the question that was asked to everyone who were participating. And then people, gave different responses. And all of the responses, in one way or another, I think they were touching this notion of pooling resources together so that we can deliver some universal public service that we will all benefit from. Right? And people have different top-of-mind priorities, but that was clearly the social commons notion, if you will. It was clearly a thread. And then we started talking about public services. And Hugh McKenzie had this great line where he said, every morning, 2 million children show up in schools. 2 million children. And then thousands of teachers in hundreds and hundreds of classrooms will receive these children, will instruct them, will take care of them, and will send them home in one piece by the end of the day. If IBM or any other company ever pulled off something like this, they wouldn't shut up about it. We would hear an ad every single time. And then we don't talk about public services nearly as much. And then Sheila Block came in, and she also talked about the invisible public services, right? We drink the water tap without wondering if it's contaminated or not. Like our food, we trust that it's safe. We know that the weather is monitored. There's also that invisible aspect of public services that keep us all safe. So we spend quite a bit of time talking about this and talking about how amazing public services are. And I think it took about 30 minutes for me to hear the phrase as a percentage of GDP. And that's a panel with human kings and Sheila Block. It took us 30 minutes to hear that sentence. It was an achievement, right? Kudos to Trish. But and then we got into it. And then we got into it, and we were all in with the different tax measures and the sales tax versus income taxes, like perennial debate, and whether there's fair, regressive, not regressive, the mechanism to close tax loopholes, all of that. Yes, we got into that. But that opening, that initial 30 minutes allowed us to those conversations to always go back to something that is quite visionary, quite like a vision. And we weren't talking about whether just like the numbers add up. You know, we're talking about, you know, can we make it happen and how can we make it happen? So in that sense, I love that panel as a model for that kind of discussion, as a rebalancing of how much time we spend in the weeds of it and how much time we devote to just putting forward that vision. So today, what allowed us to have that conversation was that social commons language and framework. That's what brought us here together. That's what set the stage for a more value-based conversation. So in that sense, it was very helpful in a way. And I think this is, the social commons it's one way of doing it. I don't think it's the only way of doing it. And I'm personally fine with that. I think there are other terms, there are other kind of knowledges and cultures that will provide us sort of the same inspiration, the same impetus to talk about social policy. And that way, I think my colleague here just share that a little bit with us, like how we could use another source of inspiration from the same conversation. So social commons is one of them. Yes, it's useful. Sure. Do we need it? Absolutely. I don't think so. I think we can tap into a whole bunch of other conversations, other inspirations, and sources of knowledge to do this, as long as we continue to talking about our values. We put it out there. We stop being shy about it. The right-wingers, they're really good at just saying what they think, and we should do the same in our respectful, in our thoughtful way, but we should just stop apologizing for demanding bold action in every safe lives.
Yeah. I would open up the floor to any observations or any questions that you might have of our panelists, and see if there's anything you want to explore further with them. Good. There you go.
I was watching a documentary from New York City, and the corporate sector is experimenting with childcare in New York City. The corporate sector is splitting the city up, and they're actually providing childcare for a portion of the city and not for another portion of the city. Most of the portions that they're trying to help are marginalized communities. So I was quite, I was upset when I watched this. And essentially what's happening in there, could happen here, that the government abdicates its responsibilities, or lets the corporate sector take over, which should have been funded by government, by taxpayers' dollars. So I'm really concerned about the whole concept of a corporate shadow government that's we are experiencing in Canada, no question, but also also in the United States. So I'd like to hear any comments on raising awareness about this shadow government that is the corporate sector. If you could address that, I'd be most grateful.
I think we talked a little bit about it in the panel about that notion of the corporate and the public, and if there are other people here from the panel and who remembers that better than I do, please feel free to jump in. But I think is the notion that we do a really good job at promoting how well and how affordable and how efficient and how just more in a more equal way the public service and the public sector is able to do things and to deliver services than the corporate world. We're a bit shy about going straight to that point and saying, there's this, I think someone in the panel brought up the fact that it should be intuitive that when we say, if we remove the profit margin, services are more affordable and we can have more of them and we can provide better services. And yet it's not that intuitive for people. There's still a question sometimes whether or not, would this be better if privatized? The fact that we allow that should even be a question, and that we have failed to make this really easy, a case for public services as a more efficient, more fair, and more affordable way of providing public services for everyone. I think there's something that needs to work.
I think what, did everyone hear the question? It was about kind of corporate big box childcare in the US, right? In New York City in particular. And then also, I guess, the way that, inequality comes up right against each other, right? And we see that sort of, we see that in the city of Toronto as well, the way that inequality is geographic and racialized as well. But it came up in our panel, and I think it probably does apply to so many of the topics that we're talking about. But getting at the idea that we have to decommodify the basics of life, right? That, access to childcare, right? The capability to go to the dentist, right? That we have to be able to set that, maybe it's not that big or ambitious, but we have to set that vision that is a way that we want to be able to structure how services are delivered, the way that we approach them, and how you de-incentivize profit making and the things that we all need to live, right? And that's really crucial. There should be more affordable housing, right? Like, there should be more capability for people to access childcare. That should be something that we can count on, and it shouldn't be something that folks are making an incredible, unreasonable profit on, and that's an investment that has to be made with with our organizing power, but also in the way that governments and democratic institutions function.
Yeah, I'm wearing the yellow of the childcare sector, which is here today. And I would be remiss not to respond to that and just echo what you said in terms of the private provision of childcare stepping in where, federal or rather government provision is failing is just a huge step in the wrong direction, right? To sort of go down the path that you've described in the city, in New York City as well. And I mean, We know that there's a large body of research that shows the value of public and nonprofit childcare and the quality standards that it meets and exceeds. And you know, as a parent with a child in cooperative nonprofit daycare, and talking to people who ventured into private daycare centers because that was all that was available, that was all that was near work, that anecdotally that was their experience, where the quality of the care and the way their requests were responded to was as though they were a customer and their child was a customer, right? And that there was a real danger and discomfort for people I know who've had that experience. It's not everyone, but it is what's borne out through research and comparison as well.
Something that comes to my mind is that our society is largely turned away from the concept of kinship systems of care. And you know, in our teachings, we're taught that there's various different stages of life, and each of those stages, for example, if we were to bring a baby into the room, I think there actually is a baby in the room, or they were in the room, usually it'll light the place up, right? Like everybody is just like, oh, look, a baby, they're so happy. And that's one of the teachings that those little ones bring us is joy, right? And when they're not in the room, we tend to talk about really serious things that don't bring people a lot of joy. And so there's these different stages of life that if we, like social commons, were all together, our society would be quite different, and we would be tackling issues keeping in mind that generation that's sitting right there, right? Because they're listening to us, they're in the room with us. And so when it comes to talking about daycare and affordable care, I think if we were to go back to kinship systems of care, that it really could change the way that society operates, and it really could change the way that, for example, nursing homes operate as well. Like, imagine bringing a whole bunch of babies over to a nursing home, and all these people are just so excited because they get to interact with a generation that they hardly ever get to see anymore. So, yeah, I think we'll just leave it at that.
Any other pressing questions? So, okay, one more, and then we'll move on to Francine.
I'll shut up.
Okay.
Just because this is sort of you at the front represent a younger generation going forward and looking to the future. I guess what challenges me is thinking about how you approach what information and what you use and what strategies going forward, given that you are the generations that have gone through 40 or 50 years of rolling horrible stuff back. And I feel very privileged to be within an age cohort where I experienced progress. Like, I saw progress in policy. You knew that your governments were responsive to need. And then I retired just at the end of the Stephen Harper years, where almost everybody I worked with was on some sort of antidepressant. So it's just like, I'm interested. We really need youth leadership, but it feels to me like we're missing a whole cohort of people with experience at really progressive policy making.
Comments?
So it's a good and, I don't know, depressing question, Sheila. I have a unique perspective because I was involved with the Campaign 2000 network for so many years, for 7 years. And to me, that was a really important and educational sort of experience working with many of the people in this room who founded the campaign, and with Oral most closely, and with Sid, realizing that even though I didn't think my expectations had been lowered over so many years, they were, right? They definitely were, right? And I learned quite a bit around organizing from John Campy and from Rob and from Margaret when it came to the city budget and holding back cuts that you know, the first city budget under Rob Ford was going to impose on the community services sector, right? So that was education, but going to Campaign 2000, where people, they weren't taking no for an answer when it came to proposing what needed to happen for families, and you know, that campaign continues to call for what's needed for universal childcare, for income security programs that actually meet the cost of living, for affordable housing and all those kinds of things. So I think the most important thing, or one of the important things, is for people to realize that they don't have to set the bar so low, or that their expectations don't have to be so low for what is possible or what should be available to them, and then continue to strive, right? So that we had the amazing experience when, you know, Laurel retired after spending 10 years on the Hill, calling, you know, under her work, I should say, she spent many years before that on the Hill as well, calling for a strong child benefit proposal. And then, you know, when she stepped down, we saw the government adopt the Canada Child Benefit, or give it that name, but it was based on proposals from, you know, our campaign for so many years, and we were continually told it, that's never going to happen. That's outlandish, right? And so seeing that happen, it was like, okay, like we cannot just call for scraps. Like, let's raise those expectations, let's call for what we actually need, otherwise we're doing a disservice to the social commons or whatever, you know, what we're trying to build collectively.
We will still see progress. We just started. So we'll see a lot of progress. We will build on the success, on the mistakes, and on the examples of your generation, and we will just double down, get as much progress as we can, and then we're gonna get tired, and someone's gonna follow us, and we're gonna continue fighting, and we're gonna continue pushing, and there's not gonna be an end to it, and even if there's no end to it, it still makes the fight worth it, and we're gonna fight, and the next generation will, and thank you for your help.
Of course, in the work that I get to do, being on this panel, so many of the conversations that we have, it is acknowledging both the gains, the resistance, the organizing, the giants whose shoulders we stand on, as much as being real about what could have been done better and more differently, and what we learn from that as we move forward, right? So it is taking all of the lessons and the learning and being able to learn from each other too, being in community together, being in solidarity with each other, because I think Anita, you know, nailed it in her summary of that panel, but we always have to be conscious of power and whose interests are being served by our pointing fingers, by the attempts to erode our solidarity and our commitment to each other. Really getting at the timeless values that are at the heart of an ideal like the commons, right? Belonging, inclusion, safety, right? Joy, creativity, like there is so much in there that is not just the ambition of any one generation or group, it's all of us. And, you know, I did talk about, you know, the workplace being an idea that I find tightly connected to commons, because in the best ways, the purpose, the work that we do every single day, it should help ensure that we feel that safety, that connectedness, that sense of community, that belonging. And it should also be a means by which we can live in the world and participate and raise our voice and build power, right? And for me, it is always making sure that it's thinking about who has power, whose interests are being served, and how do we come together to rebalance that, flip that over, and change that. And also to be very conscious of the tools that we have now that are different, and I think each generation does have its ways, right? And I say that they're tools because we've seen all the different ways that different tools have been employed over time, and that will be in the future too. But again, the mission, I think that unites us around social and economic justice is at the core of that, and we'll use whatever tools we have to always fight for that, and to remember that, you know, my opponents will always disagree, and I think that that dynamic tension will probably get us to some of the best solutions, but it's very clear who I'm fighting for and who I'm fighting against.
So if there are, okay.
Yeah, I was just going to add that, you know, the society that we live in has been developed by certain individuals, right, throughout history. And that history has not been taught to Canadians. The history that we've been taught in school, even myself, I know certain individuals have left out a lot of information, right? The slavery of black people in Canada, right? Most people don't know that there have been slaves in Canada and continue to be, right? And there's still information that we're not being taught, and our children and our grandchildren likely won't be taught. So I think until we are deciding as a collective what our younger generations need to know, right, in order to fix this flawed system, because I guess we can all agree it's extremely flawed, right? And unless they know the truth of what Canada is built on, right? If you go and Google some of those treaties, I mean, you can see why people's entire cultures have been almost completely eradicated, because somebody in 5 minutes wrote up a document that said, we're taking everything from you, right? So that flawed history that has been very, very unjust has trickled out into the rest of society, and that's why we're seeing all the problems that we have. So, yeah.
I'd like us all to thank our panel. And I would like to ask our guests to come up, Francine Mestrum, to just give us a few of her parting thoughts or concerns, or how did she read it, her first Canadian audience?
Thank you very much. I do not feel particularly qualified to be here at this moment, and I will certainly not give any conclusions. I would not be able to do that. I just would like to give a couple of comments, 4 brief points. The first point is that, as I just said to Krista, when I started to prepare this conference and reading the text of Marvyn, my first impression was, hell, they're already working with social cause. So what am I going to say there? And this impression has been confirmed. So I think you have a very good basis, and I hope very much that you will continue to work on that basis. Because social commons is about cooperation, it is about participation, it is about democracy. And I think that maybe one point to add, in order to make that possible, you will need to a certain extent popular education. Yeah. Because many people do not even know that they have rights. They do not know how to claim their rights. And they do not know that if claiming their rights, they should do it without hurting others. So that is a very important point, but I very much hope that you will continue on the basis that you have. The second point is that there are, as we have heard, there are many different ways to work for social justice, to work for social commons, to work for social emancipation. We will have a lot of work redefining all our concepts. We have mentioned them in today and yesterday. The important part is that in all the work that we are doing, we have to do our utmost to avoid the many traps of neoliberalism, which means we have to work a transformation. We have to change our world. We cannot continue in the way that we have been doing in the recent past. And in this context, allow me to say one word on universalism. And it has been mentioned by one of the speakers just in the panel. What is it that we have in common? What we have in common is our humanity. We are all equal, and we should never forget it. And that is what universalism is about. Universalism is not about having one single policy for all. That's not universal. Universalism is that we have equal rights. The opposite of equality is inequality. The opposite of the opposite of difference is sameness. So these things are different, and we have equal rights, and we need equal rights precisely because we are all different. That is why we need equal rights, and that is why we need universal policies, which does not mean the same policy for everyone, but policies that can implement, realize everyone's rights. And that, I think, is a very important point. The third point is what has been mentioned also today. We have many tools, strategic tools, to work on social commons, to work on social justice. Our human rights agenda is one important strategic tool. These human rights have to be enlarged. We have to include environmental rights. Water is already in it. We have to continue that work. The right to land, the right to clean air, these are human rights, and we have to work on them. Also, one point also to avoid misunderstandings. Poverty is not a violation of human rights. Poverty is the consequence of the violation of all human rights. And that is the main difference. You cannot say, I want to fight poverty because this is a violation. No, it is the consequence of the violation of human rights. And that is why you have to fight for the respect of human rights. My fourth point is that as I already said, we have to include environmental rights, and in the end, social commons have to be on the sustainability of life. And I think the sustainability of life is maybe the most important concept that we have today, which is sustainability of humans, sustainability of nature, sustainability of society. I think that is, that is extremely important, and we have to do that working on our individual and collective capacities. Because what it is about in the end, if you want to realize something, it is about building power. Building power for ourselves, so that we can do things. And my last and final point is purely personal. I have very much enjoyed to discuss with you. And I have very much enjoyed the way that you discuss amongst each other. This is so very different from Europe. The way, no really, the way you listen to each other, the way you respect diversity, this is so very different. And it is so very, for a European, it is so very pleasant to see this and to experience this. And I really want to thank you for that. This is a very, very important lesson. So I thank you very much. I wish you all the success you will need, and I hope you will have for working on social commons. Thank you.
On behalf of the Marvyn Novick Legacy Planning Group, and all of us in this room. Francine, this is for you. And I hope that our journey will keep going together. We got a big journey to travel. So yeah, oh no, just say this. So we're really kind of on time, and I can look at faces, and I see we're all getting tired, and those brains are moving again. So what I would like to do is start by thanking all of you for your participation, your comments, your concerns, your insights. Thank you. And then I'd also like to thank our supporters that have made this event possible, Francine's trip to Toronto, and they would be the Social Planning Network of Ontario, Family Service Toronto, the United Way of Halton and Hamilton, the Hamilton Community Foundation. I like to emphasize that in Toronto. Excuse me. Did I say that? And the United Way of Greater Toronto, and the Laidlaw and the Atkinson Foundation. So thank you all. The lectures have been videotaped, and most of our sessions, if our technology has worked, and trust it has, will be placed on our website, and that's www.socialcommons.spno.ca. So those discussions will be available for you to take into your organizations, into your community groups, into your homes. And then once again, I really want to thank the Marvyn Novick Legacy Planning Group. And I think it's important that everyone here know that all of us were touched by Marvyn. We had the privilege of knowing him. We experienced his solidarity. We were all pushed to think more deeply because of his critical analysis. And every one of us was always humbled by his unending commitment to fairness, to inclusion, to social justice, and just the dignity of humanity. So I would just like the planning group, and I don't want to see Krista's face like this, to please stand up. I will mention that we worked, and I believe Peter mentioned this, with David Lewis Stein, and just on the cusp of this event happening, David left us, and he died in September of this year. Two quick pieces of information from the planning group. Now, I'm not a fundraiser. I don't think I could raise a cent if I had to. However, back on that table, shall we show them?
Yeah. There's some on every table. And
oh, they're on every table now.
Yeah.
So the planning group, in conjunction with Ryerson University's School of Social Work, and with initial funding from the Laidlaw Foundation, has developed a scholarship in Marvyn's name. And as many of you know in this room, he was both a professor in the School of Social Work, and he was Dean of the Faculty of Community Services at Ryerson. And Marvyn had just a complete belief in the contribution of young people to the future that will emerge. So this is a tribute to Marvyn, and the first scholarship will be awarded in 2020 to start up. So we are starting, and we'd like to see this as a sustainable scholarship at Ryerson University in the Faculty of Social Work for undergraduates interested in the things we've been talking about here. So please as the fundraiser in me says, get out your wallets. And then the last thing I would say on behalf of the planning group, something entirely different. We've compiled Marvyn's salient and important writings that have made, without a doubt, a major contribution to social policy thinking and work in Canada. The documents capture, well, I would say the best of his thinking and suggested action strategies. And he worked on cities and communities and civic solidarity, responsibility for children, poverty, income security for families, full employment, decent work, social inclusion, inclusive cities, civic alliances, and a new framework for the welfare state, progressive taxation, partnerships, or social commons. And in this compilation, anthology, I'll call it, there are commentaries by his colleagues on his work. And I think the thing that will be so, really it's kind of overwhelming for all of it, is how prescient his work is today. So that anthology will be released in the new year, and it will be made available online. So I hope you will all enjoy looking at it, sharing it, and using it in your work. So to all of us, thank you.